Hey guys! Tonight we begin a journey into the shadows of Victorian England to a place where desperate young women stood trembling before iron gates, knowing that crossing that threshold meant losing everything they once were. Imagine being 17 years old, pregnant, disowned by your family, with nowhere to go except through an archway that locals called the Archway of Tears. This was not a hospital. This was not a shelter. This was a workhouse, a place deliberately designed to be so horrifying that only the truly desperate would enter. Tonight, we're uncovering the hidden history of how Victorian society punished young pregnant women, locked them away in institutions that masqueraded as charity, and tried to erase them from history altogether. Now, before we step through those iron gates together, I want to ask you something. If this story moves you, if it makes you think, if it opens your eyes to a hidden corner of history, would you take just a moment to subscribe to this channel and leave a like? But only if you genuinely feel it deserves it. And I'm curious, where are you right now? Are you lying in bed in New York, curled up on a couch in California, maybe listening while the rain falls outside your window? Drop a comment and let me know where you are in the world as we share this story together. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe let some soft sounds fill the room, and let's walk together through one of history's darkest doorways. Birmingham, England, 1835. Picture a cold November morning, fog rolling through the cobblestone streets, and a young woman named Sarah, standing before a massive stone archway. She is 17 years old, 6 months pregnant. Her family discovered her condition 3 weeks ago and threw her into the street with nothing but the clothes on her back. She has not eaten in 2 days. Her fingers are numb from the cold. And now she stands here staring up at this archway, reading the words carved into the stone above, Birmingham Union Workhouse. But Sarah knows this place by another name. Everyone in Birmingham does. They call it the Archway of Tears, because almost everyone who walks through those gates is crying. Sarah clutches a piece of paper in her shaking hand. It is her admission ticket, signed by the relieving officer she met yesterday. He looked at her swollen belly, looked at her face and said just 4 words, "You have no choice." And he was right. The year is 1835, and in Victorian England, an unmarried pregnant woman has exactly 0 good options. Let me walk you through what those options actually looked like, because understanding Sarah's choices helps us understand why the workhouse system became so nightmarish. Option 1. Keep the baby and try to survive on your own. Sounds reasonable, right? Except here is what that actually meant in 1835. First, no respectable employer would hire an unmarried mother. The social stigma was so intense that just being seen with a baby and no wedding ring could get you chased out of shops, refused service at markets, and spat upon in the street. Second, you could not legally force the father to help support the child. None, 0 legal obligation. We will talk more about the law that made this possible in our next part, but for now, just understand, the father could walk away completely, and there was nothing you could do about it. Third, even if you somehow found work, where would you leave the baby? There were no daycare centres, no social services. You would have to work 12 to 14-hour days in a factory or as a domestic servant, which meant leaving an infant alone for 14 hours. Most babies in that situation simply died. Option 2. Leave the baby at a foundling hospital. London had a famous one, the London Foundling Hospital. It sounds like a solution, right? But here is the catch. They only accepted babies from women they deemed respectable. That meant women who could prove they had been morally upright before their fall. They conducted interviews, they checked references, they investigated your character, and even if you passed all those tests, they turned away 9 out of 10 applicants because they were simply overwhelmed with desperate mothers. The women they rejected? Well, that brings us to option 3. Option 3, baby farming. This is where things get truly dark, and we will explore this in depth later in our story. But imagine this. You pay someone, usually between £2 and £10, to adopt your baby. They promise to give your child a good home. You hand over your infant and walk away, believing you have saved your child from poverty. What you do not know is that the person you just paid has no intention of caring for that baby. Some baby farmers simply let the infant starve to death slowly while pocketing the money. Others were more direct. We will meet 2 of the most notorious baby farmers later in our story: Margaret Waters, who killed at least 19 babies, and Amelia Dyer, who murdered possibly 400 infants, strangling them and dumping their bodies in the River Thames. But Sarah, standing before the Archway of Tears, does not know about baby farming yet. She just knows that option 3 involves giving up her baby to strangers, and something deep inside her says that is not the answer. Option 4, infanticide. Victorian England saw a dramatic rise in infant murders during this period, and historians directly connect this to the workhouse system we are about to explore. Desperate women would give birth alone, panic, and make a terrible choice. If caught, they faced execution by hanging. Even if not caught, the psychological burden often destroyed them. Sarah has already decided she cannot do this, which leaves her with exactly one option. Option 5, the workhouse. And here is what makes this so devastating. The workhouse was deliberately designed to be awful. It was not an accident. It was policy. The people who created the workhouse system in 1834 genuinely believed that if they made the workhouse terrible enough, poor people would be motivated to work harder and stop being poor. I know that sounds insane, but that was the actual logic. They called it the principle of less eligibility. It meant that conditions inside the workhouse had to be worse than the life of the poorest labourer outside. Think about that for a moment. The poorest workers in Victorian England lived in one-room slums, often sharing a single room with 8 or 10 other people, working 14-hour days for barely enough money to buy bread, and the workhouse was designed to be worse than that. So Sarah takes a deep breath and walks forward. The moment she crosses that threshold, everything changes. She is no longer Sarah. She is now pauper number 247. Let me walk you through what happens next, because this process was designed to strip away your identity, your dignity, and your humanity. First, she meets with the workhouse master. He is usually a local businessman who got this job because it pays well and gives him power over the desperate. Some workhouse masters are decent men trying to do an impossible job. But many, as Charles Dickens documented in his novels and essays, delight in their authority over the helpless. This particular master looks at Sarah's admission paper, looks at her pregnant belly, and makes a mark in his ledger book. Unmarried mother, he writes. In the workhouse classification system, this puts Sarah in a special category. She is not just poor, she is morally corrupted. She is a fallen woman. Sarah is taken to the receiving ward. This is where things get truly dehumanizing. First, they take away her clothes, every item. They are checking for lice, they say, but it is also about power and control. Sarah stands there, 6 months pregnant, naked, while a workhouse attendant inspects her. Then they hand her the workhouse uniform. In most workhouses, it is a rough grey dress that feels like wearing sandpaper. But here is the thing that makes Sarah's heart sink. Her dress is not grey. It is yellow. In many Victorian workhouses, unmarried mothers were forced to wear yellow dresses, bright yellow, so that everyone in the workhouse, every single person, would immediately know what you were. You were marked, branded. The scarlet letter might be famous from American literature, but Victorian England had its own version, and it was bright yellow fabric that announced your sin to everyone you encountered. After the uniform comes the hair. In some workhouses, unmarried mothers had their hair cut short or even shaved. The official reason was hygiene. The real reason was punishment and humiliation. Imagine being a 17-year-old girl who has already lost everything, your family, your reputation, your future, and now they are cutting off your hair while you stand there in a yellow dress, trying not to cry because crying will not help anything. Finally, Sarah is assigned to a section of the workhouse. Here is something most people do not realize about workhouses. They were not just one big building where everyone mixed together. They were divided into strict classifications, and you were forbidden from mixing with people in other classifications. The able-bodied men lived in one section, the able-bodied women in another. Children were separated by age and gender. The elderly had their own ward. The sick and infirm were isolated. The mentally ill, who Victorians called lunatics, were locked in their own section, and unmarried mothers, they had their own ward too, because the Victorians believed that these women might corrupt the other female paupers with their immoral influence. So Sarah is locked in a section with about 20 other pregnant women and new mothers, all wearing yellow dresses, all marked as fallen. The room she enters is cold. It is always cold in the workhouse because heating costs money. There are rows of beds, and I am using the word bed generously. They are more like wooden platforms with thin straw mattresses that are replaced maybe once a year. The mattresses are full of lice and bed bugs. The room smells of unwashed bodies, of fear, of desperation. Sarah is shown to her bed. It is pushed so close to the next bed that if she stretches out her arm, she can touch the woman sleeping beside her. That woman is named Mary. She is 19 years old. She gave birth 3 days ago. Her baby died yesterday. In the Victorian workhouse system, infant mortality rates were staggering. Some historians estimate that 10% of everyone admitted to the workhouse died within the system. For babies born to unmarried mothers in workhouses, the death rate was even higher. Some estimates suggest up to 50% of these infants died before their first birthday. Mary is lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling, not moving, not speaking. Sarah wants to say something comforting, but before she can, a bell rings. It is 6 o'clock in the morning. Time to wake up. Wait, you are thinking, but Sarah just arrived. Does she not get to rest? No, the workhouse runs on a strict schedule, and that schedule does not care if you just walked through the Archway of Tears for the first time. You're up at 6, you work until 8 at night. That is 14 hours of labour every day, 6 days a week. Sundays you get a break to attend mandatory church services, of course. But what kind of work can a 6-month pregnant woman do? Let me introduce you to one of the most hated jobs in the workhouse system. Picking oakum. Oakum is old rope from ships. It has been soaked in tar and salt water and dried in the sun until it becomes hard as wood. Your job is to pick this rope apart, fibre by fibre, with your bare fingers until you have separated it into loose threads. These threads will be sold to shipyards to seal the gaps between wooden planks on new ships. Imagine doing this for 14 hours a day. The tar gets under your fingernails. The coarse fibres cut your fingers until they bleed. The salt from the rope makes those cuts burn. Your fingers swell, they crack, they bleed more. And you are 6 months pregnant, sitting on a hard wooden bench, picking apart rope in silence. Oh, did I mention the silence rule? In many workhouses you were forbidden from speaking during work hours. The official reason was that it maintained order and discipline. The real reason was that conversation made the work more bearable, yeah, and the whole point was that nothing about the workhouse should be bearable. At noon, there is a meal break, 30 minutes. Sarah shuffles to the dining hall with the other women in yellow dresses. They sit at their own table, separated from the other female paupers. The meal is oatmeal, not the kind you get at a nice breakfast place with brown sugar and fruit. This is grey, lumpy, barely cooked oatmeal with maybe a tiny piece of bread. The portions are calculated by people who decided the minimum number of calories needed to keep a human alive and working. Charles Dickens made this famous in Oliver Twist, when young Oliver asks for more food and is met with horror. That scene was not an exaggeration. The workhouse diet was deliberately insufficient. Sarah eats her oatmeal. It tastes like paste mixed with sadness. Around her, the other women eat in silence. No one makes eye contact. Because eye contact leads to connection, and connection leads to hope, and hope is dangerous in a place like this. After lunch, it is back to picking oakum. Hours blur together. Sarah's back aches. Her fingers are bleeding now. The baby inside her kicks, and she wonders, not for the first time, what kind of world she is bringing this child into. At 8 o'clock at night, another bell. Work is over. Time for supper, more oatmeal. Then it is back to the ward. 9 o'clock, lights out. Sarah lies on her thin mattress, listening to the sounds of 20 women trying not to cry out loud. This is now her life. This is what it means to be an unmarried mother in Victorian England. This is what happens when you walk through the archway of tears. But here is what makes this story even more heartbreaking. Sarah is one of the lucky ones, because at least the workhouse is a government institution with some level of oversight, however minimal. Some women, desperate to avoid the workhouse, turned to other institutions that promised to help. Places called Magdalene Laundries, places that seemed like charities but operated more like prisons. Places where women worked even longer hours than the workhouse, received no pay at all, and were told that their suffering was necessary to wash away their sins. And some women, trying to keep their babies, turned to people who advertised in newspapers, promising to care for infants for a small fee. These women did not know they were handing their babies to murderers. All of this was connected. The workhouse system, the Magdalene Laundries, the baby farming murders, they were all part of the same social machinery, designed by Victorian society to punish women for the crime of being poor and pregnant. So tonight, we have walked through the archway of tears with Sarah. We have felt the cold November air, seen the yellow dress, picked oakum until our fingers bled. But this is just the beginning of our story. Because to truly understand how Victorian England created this nightmare, we need to go back to 1834 and examine the law that made it all possible. We need to understand how supposedly moral Christian people created a system of such deliberate cruelty. We need to explore the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, a law that Charles Dickens called one of the most infamously administered laws in English history. In our next part, we are going to pull back the curtain on how this entire system was designed. We are going to meet the men who wrote these laws and examine their shocking justifications. We are going to explore what they called the Bastardy clause, the part of the law that specifically targeted unmarried mothers. And we're going to visit the Andover workhouse scandal, where the conditions became so terrible that starving inmates were found eating rotting flesh from bones meant for fertilizer. The story gets darker before it gets lighter, but I promise you it is a story worth hearing, because these women, Sarah and Mary and thousands like them, deserve to be remembered. Their suffering deserves to be witnessed, and the system that created this suffering deserves to be understood, so that we can recognize its echoes when they appear in our own time. So rest well tonight, and when you are ready, join me for the next part of this journey, where we are going to answer the question that haunts this entire story. How did a supposedly civilized society create something so deliberately cruel? So we have just walked through the archway of tears with Sarah, felt the scratchy yellow dress against our skin, and picked oakum until our fingers bled. But now I want you to imagine something even more disturbing. Imagine that all of this suffering, the yellow dresses, the starvation rations, the deliberate cruelty, was not an accident. It was not a tragedy that happened despite good intentions. No, all of this was carefully planned, written into law, and defended by educated men who genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. Welcome to the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, and I need to warn you, understanding how this law was created and why might make you more angry than the suffering itself, because we're about to meet the men who sat in comfortable offices, who had never missed a meal in their lives, and who decided that the best way to help poor people was to terrorize them. Let me take you back to 1832. Britain is changing rapidly. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing, factories are replacing farms, people are flooding into cities looking for work, and suddenly there are more poor people than anyone knows what to do with. The old system of poor relief, which had been around since the 1600s, is buckling under the pressure. Local parishes are spending enormous amounts of money helping the poor, and wealthy landowners are getting nervous about their tax bills. So the government does what governments do. They form a commission, the Royal Commission for Inquiring into the Administration and Practical Operation of the Poor Laws. Catchy name, right? This commission was headed by a man named Edwin Chadwick, and here is something you need to know about Edwin Chadwick. He was brilliant, well-educated, utterly convinced of his own righteousness, and had absolutely no idea what it was actually like to be poor. Chadwick and his commission spent 2 years investigating the poor relief system. They interviewed people, they collected data, they wrote reports, and in 1834 they presented their findings to Parliament. Their conclusion: poor people were gaming the system, taking advantage of charity, choosing to be lazy rather than working hard. And the current system of poor relief was actually creating more poverty by making it too easy to get help. Now, before you think I am being unfair to Chadwick, let me share some actual quotes from the Commission's report. They wrote that poor relief needed to be reformed because the present system offers great and still increasing temptation to idleness and improvidence. They argued that giving money to poor people outside the workhouse created a bounty on indolence and vice. And here's my favourite. They said that the old system encouraged poor women to have children out of wedlock because they could get financial support. Let that sink in for a moment. These educated men genuinely believed that women were getting pregnant on purpose just to receive a few shillings of parish relief. As if any woman in her right mind would deliberately become an unmarried mother in Victorian England, with all the stigma, suffering and danger that entailed, just to get what amounted to maybe £2 a year. But this was the logic that drove the entire reform. And here is where things get specifically cruel for unmarried mothers. The old system, despite its flaws, had at least one protection for these women. If you could name the father of your child under oath before the parish authorities, that man was legally required to pay for the child's upkeep. It was called bastardy maintenance. The parish would track down the father, and if he refused to pay, he could be sentenced to 12 months of hard labour. Was it a perfect system? No. Many men denied paternity, and some women could not prove their claims, but it was something. It meant that men faced at least some consequence for abandoning the women they had gotten pregnant. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act swept all of that away, and I mean completely. The section that did this was called the Bastardy Clause, and it explicitly stated that fathers had zero legal obligation to support their illegitimate children. Zero. The entire financial burden fell on the mother. Period. Why would they do this? The Commission's report explains their reasoning, and I need to quote this directly because if I just summarised it, you might think I was exaggerating. The report stated that under the old system men were the victims, because women made false claims about paternity to gain income or force marriage. They argued that unmarried mothers voluntarily put themselves into the situation of a widow and had voluntarily become a mother without procuring the assistance of a husband and a father. Read that again. Voluntarily. They described women who had been seduced, raped, or simply made a mistake as having voluntarily chosen single motherhood, and therefore these women deserved no help whatsoever. But the Bastardy clause was only one part of the 1834 law. The bigger change was this. The law essentially abolished what they called outdoor relief. That meant no more giving money or food to poor people in their homes. If you wanted help, you had to enter the workhouse. And the law was very specific about what the workhouse should be like. This is where we meet the principle of less eligibility. The law stated that conditions inside the workhouse must be less eligible, meaning less desirable, than the situation of the poorest independent labourer outside. Think about what this means in practice. The poorest workers in 1834 England lived in horrific conditions, one-room slums, 14-hour workdays, diets that consisted mainly of bread and maybe some vegetables if they were lucky, high rates of disease, no health care, no safety nets, and the workhouse was supposed to be worse than that. By law, by design. Why? Because the men who created this system believed in what we might call motivational suffering. They genuinely thought that if you made poverty painful enough, people would work harder to escape it. They did not consider that maybe people were poor because there were not enough jobs, or because wages were too low, or because of bad luck and circumstances beyond their control. No. In their minds, poverty was a moral failure, and the workhouse was the cure. Let me paint you a picture of what this looked like in practice. The law required every group of parishes to form what they called a poor law union and build a new workhouse. Between 1834 and 1840, more than 350 new workhouses were built across England and Wales. These were not the old-style parish poorhouses. These were purpose-built institutions designed according to the new principles. The architect who designed many of these workhouses was a man named Sampson Kempthorne. His designs were actually quite clever from an administrative standpoint. He created what was called the cruciform design, a building shaped like a cross, with 4 wings extending from a central hub. Each wing housed a different classification of paupers, men in one wing, women in another, children in the third, elderly or infirm in the fourth. The genius of this design, from the workhouse master's perspective, was that you could watch all 4 wings from the central point. Maximum surveillance with minimum staff. But here is what that design meant for families. Imagine you are a married couple with 2 children. You've fallen on hard times. Maybe your husband got injured and cannot work, or maybe there are just no jobs available. You're starving. You have no choice but to enter the workhouse. The moment you walk through those gates, your family is torn apart. Your husband goes to the men's wing, you go to the women's wing, your 10-year-old son goes to the boys' section, your 8-year-old daughter goes to the girls' section, and here is the devastating part. You might not see each other again for months. The workhouse rules explicitly prohibited family members from different classifications from meeting or even speaking to each other. Think about that. You're in the same building as your husband and children. You can maybe see them across a courtyard, but you cannot talk to them, you cannot touch them, you cannot comfort your crying daughter. The rules forbade it. Why? Because the commissioners believed that keeping families together made the workhouse too comfortable. They worried that if families could stay together in the workhouse, poor people might actually choose to live there rather than working. Can you imagine the mindset required to believe that anyone would voluntarily choose workhouse life if they had any other option? Now, I mentioned earlier that we would talk about the Andover workhouse scandal, and this is where things get truly horrifying. Andover was a town in Hampshire, about 70 miles southwest of London. In the early 1840s, rumours started spreading about conditions in the Andover workhouse. Locals whispered that inmates were starving, that the workhouse master was a sadist, that something terrible was happening behind those walls. In 1845, a government inspector decided to investigate. What he found shocked even the hardened officials of the Poor Law Commission. The inmates at Andover were assigned to crush bones, literally take animal bones from slaughterhouses and pound them into powder to make fertilizer. This was one of the most hated jobs in the workhouse system because of the smell and the physical difficulty. But the inspector discovered something beyond the normal awfulness. The inmates were so desperately hungry that they were fighting each other for the bones that still had bits of rotting meat attached. They were eating putrid flesh from bones that had been sitting in piles for weeks. Some inmates were crushing the bones and sucking out the marrow. Human beings were so starved in a government institution that they were eating decomposing animal remains meant for fertilizer. The scandal hit the newspapers. Public outrage erupted. Parliament held hearings, and what came out during those hearings painted a picture of systematic abuse. The workhouse master, a man named Colin MacDougall, had been beating inmates, denying them food, and pocketing the money meant for their rations. His wife, who served as the matron, was having an affair with one of the male paupers, which tells you something about how the rules were enforced differently depending on your power position. But here is what is really disturbing about the Andover scandal. It was not unique. Similar investigations at other workhouses revealed the same patterns. Hunslet Workhouse in Yorkshire. Inmates so hungry they were eating raw potatoes meant for pig feed. St Pancras Workhouse in London. Children so malnourished that their growth was permanently stunted. Bethnal Green Workhouse. Elderly inmates dying of starvation, while the workhouse master sold their food rations and kept the profits. The government's response to these scandals was interesting. They did not fundamentally change the system. They did not abandon the principle of less eligibility. Instead, they added more inspections, created stricter rules for workhouse masters, and then largely continued with business as usual. Because at its core, the people in power still believed in the fundamental logic of the workhouse system. And nowhere was this logic more cruelly applied than in the treatment of unmarried mothers. Remember, the Bastardy clause had removed any legal obligation from fathers, so when a young woman like our Sarah from Part 1 discovered she was pregnant, the father could simply walk away. No consequences, no responsibility. Meanwhile, Sarah faced complete social ostracism, loss of employment, and the workhouse. The Poor Law Commissioners explicitly defended this imbalance. In their reports, they argued that punishing unmarried mothers severely would deter other women from having sex outside marriage. They called it a deterrent example. The suffering of women like Sarah was not a bug in their system. It was a feature. It was intentional. Think about the psychology of this for a moment. These were men who attended church every Sunday, who considered themselves moral, upstanding Christians, who believed deeply in charity and compassion, and yet they created a system that deliberately inflicted maximum suffering on the most vulnerable members of society. How do you reconcile those two things? Honestly, I think it comes down to one ugly truth: they did not see poor women as fully human. Not really. Or they would never say that out loud. But their actions speak clearly. When you can look at a starving pregnant teenager and decide that her suffering is motivational, when you can watch a mother separated from her children and think this is for her own good, when you can design a system that deliberately makes desperate people eat rotting meat, you have stopped seeing them as people like yourself. Charles Dickens understood this. He lived through this era. He had worked as a child in a blacking factory when his father was imprisoned for debt. He knew what poverty actually felt like. And he spent much of his career trying to wake up the comfortable middle class to the reality of what was happening in their names. In the postscript to his novel Our Mutual Friend, Dickens wrote something that I think captures the rage many people felt about the poor law. He said, "I believe there has been in England since the days of the Stuarts no law so often infamously administered, no law so often openly violated, no law habitually so ill-supervised." That was not just literary rhetoric, that was a man who had seen the workhouses, who had interviewed inmates, who had documented their suffering, telling the world that this law was a moral catastrophe. But here is what keeps me up at night about this story. The people who created the Poor Law Amendment Act were not cartoon villains. They were educated, intelligent, well-meaning people who genuinely believed they were improving society. Edwin Chadwick went on to do pioneering work in public health and sanitation. He probably saved thousands of lives with his later reforms. And yet he also created a system that caused immeasurable suffering, which raises an uncomfortable question. What systems exist in our world today that cause suffering while claiming to help? What policies do we support because they sound logical in a conference room, without thinking about what they actually mean for the people affected by them? How do we make sure we are not being our generation's version of Edwin Chadwick, convinced of our righteousness while inflicting harm? I do not have the easy answers to those questions, but I think asking them is important. Because the Poor Law of 1834 did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a democracy. It was passed by elected officials, and it has continued for decades because enough people either supported it or did not care enough to stop it. So now we understand the legal framework that created the nightmare Sarah walked into. The Bastardy clause that removed father's responsibility, the principle of less eligibility that made workhouses deliberately terrible, the classification system that tore families apart, and the underlying belief that poverty was a moral failure that needed to be punished out of existence. But legal frameworks are one thing, living through them is another. In our next part, we are going to go deeper inside the workhouse walls. We are going to follow Sarah through her entire day, hour by hour. We are going to meet some of the other women in yellow dresses and hear their stories. We are going to witness what happens when Sarah goes into labour in the workhouse infirmary. And we are going to explore the heartbreaking moment when she is forced to make an impossible choice about her baby's future. The law created the framework, but it is the human stories within that framework that really haunt me, and those stories deserve to be told. 3 weeks have passed since Sarah walked through the archway of tears. Her belly has grown larger, her fingers have healed and scarred and bled again, and she has learned the most important survival skill in the workhouse, how to become invisible, how to keep your head down, your mouth shut, and your thoughts locked away where the masters cannot reach them. But tonight, I want to pull back that veil of invisibility. I want you to see what life actually looked like inside these walls, hour by hour, person by person. Because the law we just explored created the framework, but it is the daily grinding reality that truly broke people. And there were moments, small, human moments, that reveal both the worst and the best of what people can become when pushed to the edge. It is 4:30 in the morning. Sarah wakes in darkness, not because of an alarm or a bell, but because she has to use the privy, and at 7 months pregnant, waiting until 6 o'clock is not an option. She slides off her thin mattress as quietly as possible. The workhouse ward is never completely silent. There is always someone coughing, someone crying softly into their pillow, someone praying under their breath. The privy is at the end of the hallway, just a wooden bench with holes cut in it, positioned over a cesspit below. The smell is overwhelming. Sarah has learned to breathe through her mouth. In winter, which is approaching now, the privy is freezing. ice forms on the seat, but you cannot complain. Complaining gets you punished. Punishment in the workhouse came in many forms. The official punishment was being put on reduced rations, which is almost funny when you think about it, because the regular rations were already starvation level. But reduced rations meant you got maybe half a bowl of oatmeal instead of a full bowl. For pregnant women, this could be genuinely dangerous. You're trying to grow a baby while picking oakum 14 hours a day on a few hundred calories. Your body starts eating itself. The unofficial punishments were worse. Some workhouse masters used solitary confinement. They would lock you in a small room, sometimes called the refractory cell, for days at a time. No light, no human contact, just you and the rats and your increasingly desperate thoughts. In some workhouses, particularly cruel masters used physical punishment. I found records of women being whipped, having their heads shaved as punishment rather than policy, or being forced to stand in stress positions for hours. But the punishment that Sarah fears most is being labelled mentally deficient and transferred to the lunatic ward. Because in Victorian workhouses, the line between difficult woman and insane woman was thin and arbitrary. If you protested too much, if you refused to work, if you had what we might now recognise as a nervous breakdown, you could be declared insane and locked away with people who were genuinely mentally ill. And once you were in the lunatic ward, getting out was nearly impossible. At 6 o'clock the bell rings. Time to wake officially. The women in yellow dresses rise like ghosts. No one speaks. There is a row of washing basins along one wall. Cold water only, of course. 6 basins for 23 women. You get maybe 30 seconds to splash water on your face before the next woman needs the basin. There is no soap. Soap costs money. Breakfast is at 6:30. Sarah shuffles to the dining hall in a line of pregnant women and new mothers. Have you ever noticed how pregnant women tend to walk with their hands on their lower backs? Sarah used to do that too, until she saw the matron watching her with disgust. Now she tries to walk upright, ignoring the ache in her spine. Any sign of weakness can be used against you. The dining hall is divided into sections. The able-bodied men eat in one area, the able-bodied women in another, children at their own tables, and the unmarried mothers at a table in the corner, furthest from the serving window where everyone can see their yellow dresses and know exactly what they are. Breakfast today is the same as every day. Oatmeal. Grey, lumpy, undersalted oatmeal. Sarah has been in the workhouse long enough now to understand the cruel mathematics of the workhouse diet. The Poor Law Commissioners hired doctors to calculate the minimum calories needed to keep a working adult alive. They landed on about 1,800 calories per day for men, 1,400 for women. But here is the thing. Those calculations assumed you were sitting still, not working, just existing. Workhouse inmates worked physically demanding jobs for 14 hours a day, breaking stones, picking oakum, hauling water, scrubbing floors. That kind of labour burns maybe 2,500 to 3,000 calories a day. So the workhouse diet was scientifically calibrated to slowly starve you while keeping you functional enough to work. It is quite brilliant in a horrifying way. You're always hungry, always weak, but not quite weak enough to stop working. Sarah eats her oatmeal. She has learned to eat slowly, to make it last, to trick her stomach into thinking it is getting more food than it actually is. Around her, the other women do the same. There is no conversation. The silence rule during meals is strictly enforced. But Sarah has learned to read the other women anyway. The way someone holds their spoon can tell you how long they've been here. New arrivals grip their spoons like weapons. Veterans like Sarah is becoming hold them loosely, conservatively, like they might need to make this spoon last forever. At 7 o'clock work begins. Sarah is assigned to the oakum picking room today. This is actually better than some alternatives. Pregnant women in later stages cannot do heavy labour like stone-breaking or laundry carrying, but they can sit on a hard bench and pick apart rope until their fingers bleed. The workhouse gets to extract labour from them while waiting for them to give birth. The Oakham room is in the basement. No windows. Light comes from a few gas lamps that cast everything in yellow, grey shadows. 20 women sit on wooden benches at long tables. In front of each woman is a pile of old rope and an empty basket. Your job? Pick the rope apart fibre by fibre and fill the basket. When your basket is full, you carry it to the weighing station. If you have picked enough oakum, and the required amount is calculated to be just barely achievable, you get a token. That token is your proof that you worked. No token, no dinner. Sarah sits down at her spot. She knows this bench now, knows the exact knot in the wood that digs into her left hip, knows the way the gaslight flickers on the wall behind the matron's desk, knows the sound of 20 women breathing in unison as they work. The matron today is Mrs. Thorpe. Some matrons are decent women trying to do an impossible job. Mrs. Thorpe is not one of them. She believes that unmarried mothers are fundamentally immoral and that suffering will purify their souls. She walks between the tables with a cane in her hand, not for walking but for enforcement. If she catches you talking, she raps your knuckles. If she catches you working too slowly, she adds extra rope to your pile. Sarah picks up a length of rope. It is maybe 3 feet long, stiff with tar, the fibres so compressed that pulling them apart feels like trying to separate stone. She begins working at one end, using her thumbnails to pry loose the first fibre. Tar gets under her nail. It burns. She ignores it. Have you ever done work for hours? The way time starts to distort. The first hour feels like 3. The second hour disappears completely. By the third hour, you're not really thinking anymore. Your hands just move automatically while your mind goes somewhere else. Sarah's mind goes to her family. She wonders if her father ever thinks about her, if her mother cries at night. She had 3 younger siblings, 2 sisters and a brother. Are they told that she is dead, that she ran away? Or do they know the truth, that she is in the workhouse and they have been instructed never to speak her name again? The silence in the Oakham room is not complete. There is the sound of fibres tearing, the scrape of rope against tables, breathing, coughing, always someone coughing in the workhouse because the damp and cold and poor nutrition make everyone sick. And there is another sound, very soft, that Sarah has learned to recognise. Crying. The woman next to Sarah, her name is Catherine, though they have never spoken, is crying as she picks oakum. Not sobbing, just silent tears running down her face as her hands continue working. Catherine is 16 years old. She arrived at the workhouse 5 days ago. She gave birth 3 days ago in the workhouse infirmary. Her baby lived for 18 hours. This is what no one outside the workhouse understands. The infant mortality rate for babies born to unmarried mothers in workhouses was catastrophic. Some historians estimate that nearly half of these babies died before their first birthday. Many died within days of birth. Why? Malnutrition of the mother, stress, lack of proper medical care. The workhouse infirmary was staffed by pauper nurses, other inmates who had no medical training but were assigned to care for the sick because they could not do physical labour. Imagine giving birth attended by a 13-year-old girl who has never seen childbirth before, in a cold room with no pain relief, knowing that your baby's chances of survival are maybe 50-50 at best. Catherine's baby was a boy. He was small. Of course he was small. She'd been starving for months. The pauper nurse wrapped him in a thin cloth and handed him to Catherine. For 18 hours, Catherine held her son. She was allowed to nurse him. She was allowed to whisper to him, though, what do you say to a baby you know you cannot keep? And then, on the second day, the baby stopped breathing. Just quietly stopped. The pauper nurse took him away. Catherine never learned where they buried him. There was no funeral, no marker, just another dead workhouse infant added to the statistics. And now Catherine sits next to Sarah, picking oakum with tears running down her face, and neither of them can speak because the silence rule forbids comfort. At noon, the bell rings for dinner. This is the main meal of the day, which is a bit misleading because main meal suggests substance. Today it is boiled potatoes and a small piece of bread. The potatoes are grey and watery. The bread is so hard that Sarah has to dip it in water to chew it. But this is still better than breakfast. At least potatoes have some nutritional value. Sarah eats her potato, drinks her water. They give you unlimited water, which is surprisingly generous until you realise that water costs nothing and keeps your stomach feeling full. And then she has 15 minutes of free time before work resumes. This 15 minutes is precious. It is the only time during the day when conversation is technically allowed, though you have to be careful. Too much laughter, too much apparent enjoyment, and you will draw the attention of a master or matron who thinks you are not sufficiently penitent. Sarah sits on a bench in the courtyard. It is November now, and cold, but the fresh air is worth it. Another woman in a yellow dress sits down beside her. This woman is named Ruth. She is maybe 30 years old, though. Workhouse life ages people, so she could be younger. Ruth has been in the workhouse for 2 years. Not continuously, she got out once, found work as a seamstress, but then the factory closed and she had nowhere to go, so back to the workhouse she came. Her child is 3 years old now and living in the children's ward. Ruth is allowed to see her daughter once a month for 30 minutes. That is it, 30 minutes a month with your own child. "How far along are you?" Ruth asks quietly. 7 months, Sarah says. This is the first time she has spoken to anyone except the relieving officer or workhouse staff in 3 weeks. Ruth nods. "Has anyone told you about the infirmary?" Sarah shakes her head. "When your time comes," Ruth says, keeping her voice low, "you will be taken to the lying-in ward. It is on the 2nd floor, north wing. There are 6 beds. You will share the room with whoever else is labouring or recovering. The nurse is a woman named Agnes. She is kind when she can be. But Sarah, listen to me. When the baby comes, they will try to take it from you immediately. They will say it is for medical reasons. They will say the baby needs to be weighed or cleaned or checked. Do not let them take the baby, not immediately. Hold on for as long as you can, because once they take the baby away, you do not know when you will get it back." Sarah's hand moves instinctively to her belly. What happens after? Ruth's face closes down. That depends. If your baby lives, you will be allowed to keep it with you for maybe 6 weeks while you recover. You can nurse, but then decisions get made. If you have family who will take you and the baby, you can leave. But your family already threw you out, did they not? Sarah nods. Then you have 3 options. You can stay in the workhouse with your baby. Your child grows up here in the children's ward barely knowing you. You work until you're too old or sick to work and then you die here. What is the second option? Baby farming. Someone comes to the workhouse looking for babies to adopt. They pay the workhouse a small fee. The workhouse is happy to reduce its costs. You never see your child again. And you hope, you pray, that the person who took your baby is actually going to care for it and not. Ruth stops. She does not finish that sentence. She does not need to. And the third option, Sarah asks, though part of her does not want to know. Ruth looks away. You make the decision yourself, quickly. While you still can, there are women in here who can help. I am not saying more than that. Sarah understands. She is talking about infanticide. And the terrible thing is, she understands why some women made that choice. Better a quick death than slow starvation in the workhouse or being sold to a baby farmer. Better to control the one thing you still can control than to hand your child over to an uncertain fate. The bell rings. Free time is over. Back to the Oakham room. Sarah's fingers are bleeding again. They never fully heal anymore. She wraps them in strips of cloth torn from her hem. The yellow dress is getting shorter and shorter, and eventually someone will notice and punish her for destroying workhouse property. But for now, the wrapped fingers let her keep working. The afternoon is endless. Hours blur together. Sarah's back aches. The baby kicks hard like it is protesting its future. By 6 o'clock, when the work bell finally rings, Sarah can barely stand. She shuffles to the dining hall for supper, more oatmeal because creativity is not part of the workhouse food philosophy, and then back to the sleeping ward. 8 o'clock lights out. Sarah lies on her mattress, listening to the familiar sounds of women trying not to cry. She thinks about Catherine, about Ruth, about the 18-hour baby boy with no name and no grave. She thinks about the choice she will have to make in 2 months when her own baby comes. Keep it in the workhouse, trust a baby farmer, or make the terrible choice that Ruth hinted at. And here is the thing that keeps me awake thinking about this story. Sarah is not a historical anomaly. She is not an exception. She is one of thousands, tens of thousands. Women like Sarah, women like Catherine and Ruth cycled through the workhouse system for decades. Their names were not recorded. Their stories were not told. They were just numbers in ledger books. Female pauper delivered of female child deceased. Male child born to unmarried mother adopted out. But they were real people. They had hopes and dreams before the workhouse crushed them. They had families who might have loved them if society had allowed it. They had babies who might have thrived if given half a chance. And here is the question I cannot stop asking. Where was the church during all of this? Because this was a deeply Christian society. The workhouse day was built around religious services. Grace was said before meals. Chapel was mandatory on Sundays. The entire moral justification for punishing unmarried mothers came from Christian ideas about sin and redemption. And yet where was the compassion that Jesus actually preached? Where was the forgiveness? Where was the care for the least of these? Well, some religious institutions were involved, just not in the way you might hope. Some religious orders ran their own institutions for fallen women. They called them Magdalene Laundries. And in our next part, we are going to trace the history of these laundries from their origins in 1758 to their transformation into something that looked less like charity and more like slavery. We are going to explore how the name Magdalene, taken from Mary Magdalene, the biblical figure who followed Jesus, became associated with forced labor, abuse, and exploitation. We are going to see how the workhouse system and the Magdalene system intertwined, creating a network of institutions that trapped women with almost no escape. And we are going to meet the people who tried to create alternatives, including a famous novelist who thought he had a better idea. Sarah's story continues, but first we need to understand the parallel system that claimed to offer redemption while delivering something far darker. Let me tell you about a building that opened in 1758 on a narrow street in Whitechapel, London. On paper it was founded with beautiful intentions to rescue fallen women from the streets, to offer them shelter, to give them a path back to respectability. The founders were Protestant reformers who genuinely believed they were doing God's work. They named their institution after Mary Magdalene, the biblical figure who tradition claimed was a reformed prostitute, though modern scholars tell us that was actually a mistaken interpretation. But we will get to that irony in a moment. This was the first Magdalene laundry in England. And if you could step inside that building in 1758 and then step inside a Magdalene laundry in 1858, exactly 100 years later, you would struggle to believe they were the same type of institution. Because somewhere along the way, something that started as charity transformed into something much darker, and understanding how that transformation happened tells us something important about how good intentions can pave roads to very bad places. Picture London in 1758. The city is growing rapidly. The Industrial Revolution is starting to pick up speed. Young women are flooding in from the countryside, looking for work, looking for opportunities, and finding themselves in a city that chews people up and spits them out. Some women turn to prostitution not because they want to, but because it is often the only way to survive. No welfare system, no unemployment benefits, no safety net at all. If you are a single woman with no family and no job, your options are frighteningly limited. The men who founded the first Magdalene Asylum, and yes, they were all men naturally, looked at these women with what they believed was compassion. They saw prostitutes as victims of circumstance who needed saving. Their plan was simple: give these women a place to live, teach them domestic skills, and help them find respectable employment as servants in good households. After a year or two in the asylum, the women would emerge reformed, skilled, and ready to rejoin society. And here is the fascinating thing: it actually worked, at least at first. The early Magdalene asylums were voluntary. Women could leave if they wanted to. The rules were strict, yes. Lots of prayer, lots of work, lots of lectures about virtue. But the women were learning real skills: reading, writing, sewing, cooking, laundry work. These were marketable skills in 18th century England, and many women who passed through these early asylums did go on to find legitimate employment. But there was a problem built into the foundation of the whole concept, and that problem was the name itself: Mary Magdalene. The founders chose this name because they believed Mary Magdalene was a prostitute who repented and became one of Jesus' most devoted followers. They held her up as the model: you have sinned, but through hard work and sincere repentance you can be redeemed. Except here is the thing: Mary Magdalene was almost certainly not a prostitute. That is a myth that developed in the early church when Pope Gregory I, in the year 591, conflated several different women from the Gospels into one person. The actual biblical Mary Magdalene was a woman of means who supported Jesus' ministry with her own money. She was the first witness to the resurrection. She was called the Apostle to the Apostles. She was not a prostitute who needed redemption. She was a leader, a witness, a central figure in early Christianity. But the myth stuck, and for over 1,000 years, Mary Magdalene became the symbol of the fallen woman who could be saved through suffering and penance. Can you see how problematic that is? The entire foundation of the Magdalene Laundries was based on a mistaken identity, on a false narrative that turned a powerful woman into a cautionary tale about sexual sin. And that false narrative shaped everything that came after. Because if you believe that women who have fallen need to suffer to be redeemed, then suffering becomes not just acceptable but necessary. It becomes therapeutic. It becomes righteous. By 1767, the model had spread to Ireland, where Catholic orders opened their own Magdalene asylums. By 1800, the United States had its first Magdalene institution, the Magdalene Society of Philadelphia. The movement was growing, and as it grew, it changed. Let me take you forward to around 1830. Now we have dozens of Magdalene institutions across Britain and Ireland. They are no longer just for prostitutes. Now they are accepting any woman deemed morally questionable, pregnant and unmarried. You might end up in a Magdalene asylum, too flirtatious, Magdalene asylum, born into poverty and considered at risk of falling into prostitution even if you have not yet. Magdalene asylum. The definition of fallen woman kept expanding until it included basically any woman who made the middle class uncomfortable. And something else changed too. The asylum started to focus more and more on one particular type of work. Laundry. Makes sense, right? Every household, every hospital, every hotel needs laundry services. There is always demand, and laundry work requires no expensive equipment, just water, soap, and human labour. Lots and lots of human labour. At first, this seemed like a win-win situation. The asylums could support themselves by running commercial laundries. The women learned a useful trade. The customers got their sheets and shirts cleaned. Everyone benefits. But here is where the economics started to get morally complicated. Running a laundry is hard physical labour. You are heating massive vats of water. Remember, no electric water heaters, so you are literally building fires and boiling water in huge copper pots. You are scrubbing stains out of fabric by hand. You are lifting heavy wet sheets and running them through mangles, those dangerous machines with rollers that squeeze the water out. You are working in rooms filled with steam, breathing in fumes from lye soap and bleaching chemicals. It is hot, exhausting, dangerous work. And the Magdalene asylums discovered something interesting. If you can convince women that this brutal labour is actually a form of spiritual cleansing, you do not have to pay them. You tell them they are washing away their sins along with the dirt. You frame back-breaking work as religious penance, and suddenly you have a workforce that will labour 14, 16 hours a day for nothing more than basic food and shelter. By the late 1800s, many Magdalene institutions had become highly profitable commercial laundries that just happened to use unpaid religious labour. The Catholic Church was particularly successful at this model. They ran laundries all over Ireland, England and Scotland. They took in contracts to clean linens for hospitals, schools, hotels and wealthy households. They made substantial profits, and they paid the women nothing. Now, before you think I am being unfair, let me share some numbers. By 1900, there were more than 300 Magdalene asylums in England alone, more than 20 in Scotland, and in Ireland, the Magdalene laundries became such a massive industry that they were washing the sheets for basically every major institution in the country. Historian Francis Finnegan, who wrote one of the definitive books on this subject, estimated that tens of thousands of women passed through these institutions in the 19th and 20th centuries. And here is something that should shock you. The last Magdalene laundry in Ireland did not close until 1996. 1996. That is not ancient history, that is within living memory. There are women alive today who worked in these laundries who can tell you firsthand what it was like. But let me take you back to the Victorian era, because that is when the system really calcified into something dark. By 1840, there was a clear distinction emerging between two different approaches to fallen women. You had the workhouse system, which we have already explored, government-run, punitive, designed to be terrible, and you had the Magdalene asylums, which were privately run by religious orders and presented themselves as kinder, more compassionate alternatives, and in some ways they were. Magdalene asylums did not have the same starvation-level rations as workhouses. The women were not in yellow dresses being publicly marked as sinners. Well, not in the same way. They could stay as long as they needed to, rather than being kicked out after a set period. On paper, it looked more humane. But here is what they had in common with the workhouses. Both systems were built on the idea that these women needed to be separated from society. Both systems believed that harsh conditions and hard labour were good for the soul. Both systems denied women their freedom and their wages. And both systems were run primarily by people who had never experienced poverty or desperation themselves, making moral judgments about women whose circumstances they could never truly understand. There is one particular Magdalene asylum I want to tell you about, because it represented what was supposed to be the best of these institutions. It was in London, run by the Church of England, and it had a reputation for being strict but fair. Women who entered this asylum signed a contract agreeing to stay for at least 2 years. They attended religious services 4 times a day. They worked in the laundry from 6 in the morning until 8 at night. They slept in dormitories with 20 other women. They were forbidden from leaving the premises without permission. They could not receive visitors without approval. Their letters were read by the asylum supervisors before being sent. Does that sound like charity to you? Or does that sound like imprisonment? The supervisors would have been offended by that comparison. They would say, "But the women choose to be here. They can leave any time they want." And technically, that was true, in theory. But try thinking about the practical reality. If you are a woman who has been in a Magdalene asylum for 6 months, where do you go if you leave? You have no money. You've been working for free. You have no job prospects. The asylum has not been helping you find employment. They have been using your labour for their own profit. You have no references. Leaving early would be seen as a failure, as proof that you are not truly reformed. And you still carry the stigma of being a fallen woman. So yes, technically you can walk out the door, but can you really? This is what we call coercive charity. It is charity that traps you. It offers help with one hand while taking away your options with the other. Now, let me tell you about someone who saw through this whole system and tried to do something different. In 1846, a wealthy philanthropist named Angela Burdett Coutts approached a famous novelist named Charles Dickens with an idea. She wanted to create a home for fallen women, but she wanted to do it differently. No religious orders running it, no unpaid labour disguised as penance, no treating the women as perpetual sinners who needed endless reformation. Instead, she envisioned a place that would train women in practical skills and help them emigrate to the colonies, to Australia, Canada, South Africa, where they could start completely new lives with no one knowing their pasts. Dickens loved this idea. He threw himself into the project with characteristic intensity. He found a house in Shepherd's Bush, a quiet neighbourhood in West London. He called it Urania Cottage, though he always referred to it as simply the home. And the philosophy behind Urania Cottage was revolutionary for its time. First, the women wore colourful dresses. Dickens insisted on this. He said that drab uniform clothing made women feel like prisoners, and he wanted them to feel human. Can you imagine how radical that was? In workhouses, women wore grey. In many Magdalene asylums, they wore shapeless brown or black dresses, but at Urania Cottage, women wore blue, green, red, bright, cheerful colours. Second, there was no forced silence. Women could talk to each other, form friendships, support each other. This was crucial because isolation is a tool of control. When you cannot talk to your fellow sufferers, you cannot organise, you cannot compare experiences, you cannot build solidarity. Dickens understood that women needed community to heal. Third, and this is the part that really set Urania Cottage apart, the women were never asked about their pasts. Dickens wrote explicit instructions. Their past lives should never be referred to. He believed that constantly forcing women to dwell on their sins, to confess and repent and flagellate themselves emotionally, was destructive. Instead, the home focused entirely on the future. What skills do you want to learn? What kind of life do you want to build? How can we help you get there? The program lasted about a year. Women learned to read and write if they did not already know how. They learned household management, cooking, sewing, accounts, practical skills that would make them employable. They worked in the household, but they also had leisure time. They could read books, they could garden. Dickens made sure there were flower beds where women could plant their own seeds and watch things grow, which he thought was therapeutic. They could sing around the piano in the evenings. And here is the most important part. At the end of the program, women who wanted to could emigrate. Angela Burdett Coutts paid for their passage. They were given new clothes, some money to start their new lives, and references that said nothing about their time in the home. They could reinvent themselves completely. So did it work? Well, Dickens kept meticulous records. Between 1847 and 1858, 156 women passed through Urania Cottage. Of those, 30 emigrated successfully and built new lives. We have letters and records proving they married, had families, became respected members of their communities. Another 33 found employment in England and left the home in good standing. 27 left of their own accord before completing the programme. And sadly 7 were expelled for behaviour issues, and the rest had mixed outcomes that Dickens could not fully track. So that is a success rate of roughly 40% for the emigration goal, and maybe 60% if you include the women who found respectable employment in England. Not perfect, but compare that to the workhouse system, where the goal was not success but punishment, or to the Magdalene asylums, where women might spend years or even decades working for free with no plan for their future. Urania Cottage proved that there was an alternative, that you could help fallen women without destroying their dignity. That redemption did not require suffering. That practical support worked better than moral lectures. So why did not everyone adopt this model? Why did the Magdalene Laundries continue to operate in their harsh, exploitative way for another century and a half? I think there are a few answers. First, money. Urania Cottage was expensive. It required a wealthy patron like Angela Burdett Coutts, who was willing to fund it out of her own pocket. The Magdalene Laundries, by contrast, made money. They supported themselves through the unpaid labour of the women. They did not need wealthy benefactors because they were profitable businesses disguised as charities. Second, control. The religious orders that ran the Magdalene Laundries genuinely believed that hard work and suffering were spiritually beneficial. They were not trying to prepare women for independent lives. They were trying to save their souls. And in their theology, the best way to save a soul was through penance, through labour, through submission to authority. Dickens's model was all about empowering women to make their own choices. The religious model was about teaching women to be obedient. And third, let us be honest, there was an element of social control at play. The workhouses and the Magdalene Laundries served a purpose for Victorian society. They removed problematic women from public view. They punished sexual transgression in a way that reinforced social norms. They provided a warning to other women. This is what happens if you step outside the boundaries we have set for you. Urania Cottage, by allowing women to escape to new lives, actually undermined that social control. It suggested that fallen women could be redeemed without punishment, which was not a message that Victorian moralists wanted to send. Urania Cottage closed in 1862, not because it failed, but because Dickens and Angela Burdett Coutts had a falling out. Dickens was going through a scandalous separation from his wife, possibly involving an affair with a young actress, and Burdett Coutts, who was deeply religious, could not continue working with him, so the funding dried up and the home closed. But the Magdalene Laundries, they thrived. By the late 1800s, they had become such established institutions that they were essentially invisible. They were just part of the social landscape, those buildings on the edge of town where the fallen women lived. Everyone knew they were there. No one talked about them, and certainly no one talked about what was actually happening inside them. And what was happening inside them was about to get much, much worse. Because as we move into the 1890s and the early 1900s, the Magdalene Laundries stopped even pretending to be temporary reformatory institutions. They became places where women might spend their entire lives, working in the laundries from girlhood to old age, never paid, never freed, essentially enslaved in the name of God. In our next part, we're going to step inside one of these laundries at the height of their power. We are going to follow a typical day in the life of a Magdalene girl. They called them girls even when they were women in their 40s or 50s. We are going to see how the laundry work actually operated, what conditions were like, what the rules were, and how the nuns maintained control over women who had no escape. We are going to explore how these institutions were exempted from labour laws that protected other workers, and we are going to hear the voices of survivors, women who lived through this system and finally, decades later, were able to tell their stories. Because while Sarah's story in the workhouse is heartbreaking, at least the workhouse was always honest about what it was. It was punishment. It was terrible. But everyone knew that. The Magdalene Laundries were something more insidious. They were punishment disguised as charity. They were exploitation dressed up as salvation. And that, in some ways, makes them even harder to forgive. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine heat. Not the comfortable warmth of a summer day or the cosy heat of a fireplace. No, I mean the oppressive, suffocating, inescapable heat of a room filled with boiling water and steam. The kind of heat that makes your lungs hurt when you breathe. The kind that soaks your clothes with sweat within minutes and never lets them dry. The kind that after 8 or 10 or 14 hours makes you feel like you might actually die if you cannot step outside into fresh air. Now, open your eyes, because that heat was real. That was the daily reality for thousands of women who worked in Magdalene laundries across England, Ireland and Scotland. And the most remarkable thing about this hell is that the women enduring it were not being paid. Not a single penny. Because the nuns who ran these laundries had convinced them and society that this suffering was holy, that washing other people's dirty sheets was somehow washing away their own sins. Let me take you inside a specific laundry. The year is 1895. The place is Cork, Ireland, at the Good Shepherd Magdalene Laundry on Sunday's Well Road. This is one of the more respected institutions run by the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, a Catholic order specifically dedicated to the reformation of fallen women. If you walked past this building, you would see a respectable stone facade, neat gardens, and a small chapel. You would hear the women singing hymns at morning prayer. You might think to yourself how wonderful that these nuns are providing charity to unfortunate girls. But if you could see past that facade, if you could walk through the unmarked door that leads to the laundry itself, you would discover something very different. It is 5 o'clock in the morning. A bell rings, harsh and insistent. The women, about 40 of them in this particular laundry, wake in a long dormitory room lined with narrow metal beds. Unlike the workhouse, where pregnant women wore yellow dresses, here everyone wears the same uniform, a long grey dress, shapeless and rough, with a white apron over it. Your hair is covered with a white cap. You are not allowed to look in mirrors. Vanity is a sin, they say, though the real reason is that they do not want you to remember what you looked like before you came here. They do not want you to remember that you are a person with an identity beyond Magdalene Girl number 23. The women dress in sants. Silence is not officially mandated here the way it was in the workhouse, but it is strongly encouraged. Unnecessary conversation is considered idle chatter, which is considered a venial sin, which means you need to confess it, which means punishment. So most women have learned to communicate through glances, through small gestures, through the language that develops when words are too dangerous. At 5:30, morning prayers. All 40 women kneel in the small chapel attached to the laundry. The Mother Superior leads them through the rosary. The women respond in unison, their voices flat, exhausted before the day has even begun. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. I wonder if any of them catch the irony. They are praying to Mary, the mother of Jesus, asking her to pray for them now and at the hour of our death. And yet these women are here precisely because they became mothers, or might become mothers, or were accused of the kinds of sins that could lead to motherhood. They are praying to the ultimate mother while being punished for their own potential or actual motherhood. At 6 o'clock, a breakfast of porridge and weak tea. The porridge is better than workhouse oatmeal. The nuns do feed the women adequately because they need them strong enough to work. But it is plain, flavourless. The same thing every single morning. Some women have been eating this same breakfast for 5 years, 10 years. There are women in this laundry who arrived as teenagers and are now in their 30s, still here, still eating this porridge, still washing sheets. And that is the thing that nobody outside these walls understands. The Magdalene Laundries were supposed to be reformatory institutions. The word reformatory implies temporary. You come in broken, you get reformed, you leave fixed. That was the theory. But in practice, many of these institutions operated more like prisons, with no fixed sentences. You came in, and you might never leave. Why? How could they keep women indefinitely when the asylums were supposedly voluntary? Well, let me introduce you to the psychological mechanisms of control. First, they isolated you from the outside world. When you entered the laundry, you were given a new name. Not a full change of identity like entering witness protection. That would be too dramatic. No, they just changed your first name to something more suitable. If your name was Bridget, you became Mary. If you were Catherine, you became Margaret. If you were already Mary, well, there were plenty of saint names to choose from. Mary Magdalene, Mary of Egypt, Mary of Bethany. The point was to sever your connection to your old self. The person you were before does not exist anymore. You are remade in the image the nuns have chosen for you. Second, they controlled all communication with the outside. You could not send or receive letters without permission. And if permission was granted, the letters were read before being sent out. Imagine trying to write an honest letter about your conditions when you know the Mother Superior will read it before it leaves the building. So you write bland, cheerful lies. I am well. The sisters are kind. I am learning valuable skills. Pray for me. And your family receives these letters and thinks you are fine. They do not know you're screaming silently between every line. Third, they use shame as a weapon. You are constantly reminded that you were there because of your own moral failings. Every sermon, every prayer, every private talk with a nun reinforced the same message. You are sinful, you are broken, you are lucky that these holy women are willing to help someone as degraded as you. After months or years of hearing this, many women internalized it. They genuinely believed they deserved to be there. They believed that suffering was their penance. They believed that leaving would be a sign of moral failure, proof that they were not truly reformed. And fourth, they made leaving practically impossible. Remember, you'd been working for free, you had no money saved, you had no job prospects. Who would hire a woman who had been in a Magdalene laundry? The stigma was enormous. You had likely been cut off from your family, either because they disowned you, or because the nuns had convinced them that continuing contact would impede your reformation. So where would you go? What would you do? The laundry became a trap not because the doors were locked, though sometimes they were, but because every other door in your life had closed. At 6:30, the women file into the laundry itself. Let me describe this room in detail because it is important to understand exactly what the work entailed. The laundry is a vast space, maybe 50 feet by 80 feet, with a high ceiling and small windows near the top. The windows are kept small deliberately. Large windows would let out too much heat, and the heat is necessary for the work. Along one wall are 6 massive copper boilers, each one about 4 feet in diameter and 3 feet deep. These boilers are heated by coal fires underneath. The women have to maintain these fires all day, which means shoveling coal, which means breathing coal dust mixed with steam. By the end of the day, the women who work near the boilers have black streaks running down their faces, where sweat has mixed with coal dust. The boilers are filled with water that needs to reach boiling temperature. Then the dirty laundry goes in. Sheets from hospitals, tablecloths from hotels, priests' vestments, nuns' habits, shirts and dresses and undergarments from wealthy households who send their washing out. The laundry churns in the boiling water mixed with lye soap. Lye is caustic, it burns skin. The women who handle the lye-soaked laundry develop rashes and chemical burns on their hands and forearms. Their fingerprints literally wear away from the constant exposure to harsh soap. After boiling, the laundry needs to be scrubbed. There are long wooden scrubbing tables with ribbed surfaces. You take a piece of sopping wet fabric, lay it on the table, apply more soap and scrub with a stiff brush until the stains come out. This is back-breaking work. You are bent over the table for hours. Your shoulders ache. Your hands blister. And you cannot complain because complaining is interpreted as lack of contrition for your sins. Then comes rinsing. The heavy, wet laundry has to be lifted into tubs of clean water, swished around, lifted out, wrung by hand and hung on lines to dry. Do you have any idea how heavy a wet sheet is? A single bed sheet soaked with water can weigh 15 or 20 pounds. The women lift hundreds of them every day. By the time they are 30 years old, many of them have permanent back injuries. The drying lines are strung across another section of the laundry. In winter, when the laundry cannot be hung outside, the drying room becomes a steam bath. The women who work in the drying room are constantly drenched in sweat. One survivor later described it this way: "The heat was unbelievable. You could not leave your station unless a bell went. Some days you thought you might faint, but you could not sit down. You just had to keep working." After drying comes ironing. The irons are heavy cast iron implements heated on stoves. Before electric irons, before steam irons, you literally held a piece of metal that weighed 5 or 6 pounds and had been heated to temperatures hot enough to scorch fabric if you were not careful. Your arms ache from holding this weight. You get burned regularly when you test the iron's temperature, or when you accidentally brush your arm against the hot surface. Nobody cares. Burns are part of the job. Bandages are for serious injuries only. Finally, the clean, ironed laundry is folded, packed, and prepared for delivery. This is considered light work, so it is often given to the older women or the ones who are sick. Because yes, you still work when you are sick. You work when you have a fever. You work when you have infected burns on your hands. You work when you have menstrual cramps so bad you can barely stand. The only thing that excuses you from work is being literally unable to get out of bed. And even then, you'd better be visibly dying or you will be accused of malingering. The women work until 8 o'clock at night. That is 14 hours of this labour, with breaks for prayers, morning prayers, noon prayers, evening prayers, night prayers, and a break for dinner at midday, which is usually bread and soup, and then back to work. And here is the thing that makes this entire system so perverse. The laundries were making enormous profits. Let me give you some numbers, because this is where the moral bankruptcy of the system becomes undeniable. A commercial laundry in 1895 London, using paid workers, charged about 3 shillings to wash and iron 100 pieces of laundry. The workers were paid about 15 shillings per week for their labour, so the profit margin was relatively thin, maybe 20 to 30% after paying for labour, coal, soap, and building maintenance. But a Magdalene laundry had no labour costs, 0. The women worked for free, so the same 100 pieces of laundry that cost 3 shillings brought in pure profit minus only the cost of materials and overhead. The Magdalene laundries could undercut the prices of commercial laundries while making massive profits. And what did they do with those profits? Officially, the money went to support the institution, to fund the nuns' own living expenses, to build new chapels and convents. The women who actually did the work saw none of it. And here is the really infuriating part. This was legal, completely legal. In 1901, Parliament passed the Factory and Workshop Act, which limited working hours for girls aged 13 to 18 to 12 hours per day. 12 hours was considered the maximum that was safe and humane, but the law explicitly exempted religious institutions. The lawmakers decided that institutions engaged in religious and charitable work did not need to follow labour regulations. Think about what that meant. A girl working in a commercial laundry had legal protections. Her working hours were limited. Her workplace had to pass safety inspections. She had to be paid minimum wages. But that same girl, if she ended up in a Magdalene laundry, had zero protections. She could be worked 16 hours a day. The workplace did not need to pass any inspections, and she did not need to be paid at all. How is that justice? How is that charity? Some reformers tried to change this. In the early 1900s, female factory inspectors, women who had fought hard to even be allowed into the profession, started visiting Magdalene laundries on voluntary inspections, and what they found horrified them. They documented the long hours, the dangerous equipment, the chemical burns, the lack of ventilation, the absence of fire escapes. They wrote reports, they presented evidence to Parliament. And you know what happened? Nothing. Well, not quite nothing. The religious orders agreed to voluntary compliance with some safety standards. They installed a few more windows, they bought some fire extinguishers, they cut working hours from 16 hours a day to 14, and then they continued exactly as before, just with slightly better public relations. The truth is, British society wanted the Magdalene laundries to exist. They served a purpose. They removed problematic women from society. They provided cheap laundry services to institutions that needed them. They allowed the middle class to feel good about themselves. Look how charitable we are, providing these fallen women with meaningful work and moral guidance. Never mind that the work was exploitation and the guidance was psychological abuse. And the women themselves, many of them genuinely believed what they had been told. A survivor named Mary Smith, who was sent to a Magdalene laundry after being raped. Yes, you read that correctly, she was raped, and then sent to a reformatory as if she were the criminal, later described how she was taught to think about her work. The nuns told her that every sheet she washed clean was like washing her own soul clean. Every stain she removed was removing her own sin. The more she suffered, the more pure she became. Can you imagine the psychological damage of that teaching? You're suffering because you deserve to suffer. Your pain is holy. If the work is too hard, if your hands are bleeding, if you can barely stand from exhaustion, that just means you're not yet pure enough. You need to suffer more, work harder, pray more fervently, and maybe someday, if you are very good and very obedient, you might be worthy of leaving. Except for many women, that day never came. They worked in the laundries for decades. Some died there, and when they died, they were buried in unmarked graves in cemeteries on the laundry grounds. No headstones, no names, just anonymous dead women who had spent their lives washing other people's dirt and being told it was for their own good. I need you to sit with that for a moment, because this was not ancient history. This was not the Middle Ages. This was the Victorian era, the time of supposed progress and enlightenment and moral advancement. This was happening while Britain was building railroads and telegraphs and declaring itself the most civilized nation on earth. This was happening while people went to church on Sundays and praised God for their blessings and dropped coins in collection plates for charitable works. And those charitable works included laundries where women worked as unpaid slaves in the name of salvation. In our next part, we need to talk about what happened to the babies, because we have focused on the women in workhouses and laundries, but we have not yet fully explored what happened to their children. And this is where the story becomes even darker, if you can imagine that. We are going to trace the connection between the Magdalene system and the mother and baby homes, where pregnant women gave birth and then had their infants taken away. We are going to visit one particular home in Tuam Island, where a researcher discovered something in 1993 that shocked the entire world. We're going to talk about forced adoptions, about babies who died in suspicious numbers, and about the discovery of nearly 800 tiny bodies buried in a mass grave. And we are going to ask the question that haunts everyone who learns this story. How did this happen? How did supposedly moral religious people create a system that treated babies as commodities and mothers as criminals? The laundry line was just one thread in a much larger web of exploitation. And it is time to follow that thread to its most heartbreaking destination. There is a sound that haunts the nightmares of women who survived the mother and baby homes of Ireland. It is not the sound of a baby crying, though that was common enough, that chorus of hungry infants in overcrowded nurseries. No, the sound that stayed with them was silence. The sudden, absolute silence when a nun walked into the room where you were holding your baby when she said it is time, when she reached down and lifted your child from your arms, and you just knew that you would never hold that baby again. And then the only sound was your own sobbing, which you tried to muffle because crying too loudly meant you were being difficult, which meant punishment. Welcome to the other side of the Victorian fallen women system. We have walked through workhouses where Sarah picked oakum until her fingers bled. We have stood in Magdalene laundries where women washed sheets for 14 hours a day without pay. But what happened to the babies? Where did they go? What was their fate in this machinery of moral judgment and religious control? The answer is more horrifying than you might imagine, and it involves a place called Tuam, a small town in County Galway, Ireland, where in 1993 a local historian named Catherine Corliss made a discovery that would eventually expose one of the darkest secrets of the 20th century. But let me start at the beginning, because to understand Tuam, we need to understand how mother and baby homes functioned as part of the larger system we have been exploring. Imagine you're a young woman in 1890. You're pregnant and unmarried. Your family has disowned you. You have three options. As we discussed earlier, the workhouse and a Magdalene laundry, or a mother and baby home, the first two we know about. But what exactly was a mother and baby home? On paper it sounds almost benevolent. Unlike workhouses that separated mothers from babies almost immediately, and unlike Magdalene laundries that were not equipped to handle pregnant women, mother and baby homes were specifically designed for unmarried mothers. You could go there during your pregnancy. You would give birth there. You could stay there with your baby for a period of time, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, sometimes longer. You would work to earn your keep, but you would also be with your child. And during that time, the nuns would arrange for your baby to be adopted by a good Catholic family. Then you could leave, return to society, and hopefully marry a man who did not know about your past. That was the theory. That was what families were told when they sent their pregnant daughters to these homes. That was what society believed was happening. But the reality... Let me introduce you to the Bon Secours Mother and Baby Home in Tuam. It opened in 1925 and operated until 1961. It was run by the Bon Secours Sisters, a Catholic order whose motto was "Your compassion, our mission." The building itself was a former workhouse. And is that not grimly appropriate? The Victorians built the workhouse. It operated as a punishment facility for the poor. And then when the workhouse system officially ended, the building was simply repurposed for a new form of punishment. When a pregnant girl arrived at Tuam, she was assigned to a ward based on whether this was her first child or if she was what they called a repeat offender, a woman who had fallen into sin more than once. First-time mothers were housed separately from repeat mothers, because the nuns did not want the first-timers corrupted by the moral depravity of women who had made the same mistake twice. The pregnant women worked while they waited to give birth. Not laundry work like the Magdalene girls. Most mother and baby homes were not equipped for commercial laundry. Instead, they did domestic work, cooking, cleaning, sewing, gardening. All unpaid, of course. The homes were run on the same economic principle as the laundries, free labour from morally compromised women who were told they should be grateful for the opportunity to work off their sins. When a woman went into labour, she was taken to the delivery room. In most mother and baby homes, pain relief was not provided. There is some debate about whether this was due to lack of resources or deliberate policy, but survivors consistently report being told that the pain of childbirth was their punishment for the sin of fornication. You made your bed, now lie in it. Or rather, you spread your legs, now suffer the consequences. The cruelty was often that explicit. One survivor described giving birth alone in a cold room with only a young, inexperienced nun in attendance. No doctor, no midwife, just a nun who had never given birth herself, who had no medical training, who offered no comfort and certainly no sympathy. When the survivor screamed from the pain, the nun told her, "This is what you deserve, remember this the next time you're tempted to sin." After birth, if the baby survived, and that is a significant if, the mother was usually allowed to keep the infant with her for a few weeks or months. This period served multiple purposes. First, the mother could breastfeed, which was cheaper than formula. Second, it gave the baby time to fatten up and become more adoptable. And third, it created a bond between mother and child that made the eventual separation even more traumatic, which the nuns believed was pedagogically valuable. If losing your child did not hurt enough to teach you a lesson, then maybe you had not really learned anything. The nurseries in these homes were overcrowded and understaffed. At Tuam, there were sometimes 60 or 70 infants being cared for by just 2 or 3 young women, often teenagers themselves, either residents of the home or local girls from poor families working for almost no wages. How do you properly care for 70 babies? You cannot. It is mathematically impossible. Each baby needs to be fed, changed, held, comforted, bathed. If you spend just 15 minutes per baby, that is over 17 hours of work. And there are only 24 hours in a day, and you need to sleep sometime. So corners got cut. Babies were fed on rigid schedules rather than when they were hungry. Crying infants were left to cry because there was no one available to pick them up. Dirty diapers were changed when convenient rather than when necessary. And inevitably, babies got sick. In those overcrowded conditions, disease spread like wildfire. Gastroenteritis, respiratory infections, measles, whooping cough. In the era before antibiotics, these illnesses could be fatal, and in mother and baby homes, the mortality rate was staggering. Let me give you some numbers, because these numbers are important. In Ireland, between 1922 and 1998, approximately 35,000 unmarried mothers passed through mother and baby homes. During that same period, researchers estimate that about 9,000 babies died in these institutions. 9,000. That is a death rate of roughly 25 to 30%. To put that in perspective, the infant mortality rate in Ireland during the same period for babies born to married mothers was about 5 to 7%. So babies born in mother and baby homes were 4 to 5 times more likely to die than babies born to married parents. Why? Malnutrition was a major factor. The mothers were often malnourished themselves. Remember, they were working long hours on limited food. Malnourished mothers produce poor quality breast milk or cannot produce enough. Then the babies become malnourished. Then they get sick. Then they die. It is a predictable cascade. Overcrowding was another factor. Too many babies in too small a space with too few caregivers. Neglect, whether intentional or simply due to impossible circumstances. And in some cases, historians have found evidence of something even darker. Deliberate neglect of sickly or disabled infants, because healthy babies were adoptable. Healthy babies could be sold, yes, sold to wealthy families, often in America, who were willing to pay for the privilege of adopting an Irish Catholic baby. But sickly babies, disabled babies, they were not profitable. They were expensive to care for and impossible to place. So they were, in the cold economic calculation of these institutions, better off dead. I need to be clear here. I am not saying the nuns deliberately murdered babies. Most historians agree that outright murder was probably rare, but there is a spectrum between murder and care, and somewhere on that spectrum is neglect so profound that it becomes indistinguishable from murder. If you know a baby needs medical attention and you do not provide it because treating sick babies costs money, what is that? If you put the sickest infants in a separate room where they receive minimal care and you wait for them to die, what is that? When babies died, and they died constantly, multiple babies per week in some of these homes, what happened to their bodies? This brings us back to Catherine Corliss and her discovery in Tuam. Catherine was a local historian, not a professional researcher, just someone who cared about her town's history. In the early 2000s, she started investigating the Bon Secours home because she had heard whispers about it her whole life. Local people remembered the home, some had relatives who had been there, and there were rumours about a large number of deaths. Catherine started with the death certificates. She went through local records and found that 796 children had died at the Tuam home between 1925 and 1961. 796 children in 36 years. That is more than 20 children per year, every year, for decades. But here is what puzzled Catherine. Where were they buried? There was a small graveyard near the former home, but it had nowhere near 796 graves. So where were the bodies? She kept digging through records. She talked to elderly locals who remembered the home, and several people told her the same disturbing story. Children playing near the home in the 1970s had found what looked like small skeletons in an underground chamber. The area had been filled with rubble and covered over, but the memory persisted. Catherine petitioned the authorities to investigate. At first, she was ignored. Then, as she persisted and started publishing her findings, the Irish government reluctantly agreed to conduct a survey. In 2014, test excavations began. What they found was beyond comprehension. Underground, in what had once been septic tanks and sewage chambers for the old workhouse, were the remains of human infants. Bones piled upon bones. Tiny skulls, rib cages no bigger than your hand. The remains were jumbled together, mixed with garbage, showing no evidence of proper burial rites. No coffins, no shrouds, just small bodies dumped in the underground chambers like waste. Further investigation confirmed that there were significant quantities of human remains in these chambers, consistent with Catherine's research showing nearly 800 deaths. The babies who died at Tuam had been disposed of in sewage tanks. When this news broke, it caused international outrage. How could this happen? How could nuns, women supposedly devoted to God and compassion, treat dead babies like garbage? How could a society let this happen? But here is the uncomfortable truth. Society did not just let it happen. Society enabled it. Society created it. Because what were these babies really in the eyes of Irish Catholic society? They were evidence of sin. They were illegitimate. They were, in the moral framework of the time, literally bastards, a word that was not just descriptive but actively derogatory. Their mothers were fallen women who had shamed their families. The babies themselves carried that shame. They were tainted from birth. So when these babies died, there was no public mourning. Their deaths were not announced in newspapers. Their families, if they even knew, did not attend funerals because there were no funerals. The babies were just quietly disposed of, and everyone preferred not to think about it too much, and Tuam was not unique. As investigations expanded following Catherine's discovery, Researchers found similar practices at other mother and baby homes across Ireland. Mass graves, infant remains in burial pits, death rates that were catastrophically high. The pattern was everywhere once people started looking. But let us talk about the babies who survived, because for many of them, survival meant forced adoption, and this is where the system reveals its true nature as a business. The adoption process worked like this. When your baby was maybe 6 months old and healthy enough to be attractive to adopters, a nun would come to you and say it was time. You were not consulted. You were not asked if you wanted to give up your child. You were told. The baby was taken from you, sometimes while you screamed and fought, sometimes while you stood in numb silence because you had learned that resistance was futile. You were told the baby was going to a good Catholic family. You were told you would never see the child again. You were told to forget you ever had a baby and return to your life. You were not told that the adoptive family had paid money. The amounts varied, but it was common for families to pay £500 to £2,000 for an Irish baby in the 1950s and 60s, equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars today. Officially, this was a donation to cover the costs of the child's care. But functionally, it was a purchase price. The mother and baby homes were trafficking in infants, and the babies of unmarried mothers were the product being sold. Many of these babies went to America. There was huge demand in the United States for healthy white Catholic babies. American couples would go through Catholic adoption agencies, which had connections to the Irish mother and baby homes. The paperwork would be processed, money would change hands, and suddenly an Irish baby would be on a plane to New York or Boston or Chicago, going to live with parents whose names the birth mother would never know. Can you imagine being that mother? You spend months with your baby, you nurse that baby, you sing to that baby, you start to believe that maybe, somehow you will be allowed to keep your child. And then one day, without warning, the baby is gone, ripped from your arms. You're told nothing about where the baby went. You do not know if your child will be loved or abused or neglected. You do not know if you will ever learn what happened to them. You're just expected to go on as if you never had a child at all. And if you broke down, if you could not stop crying, if you became depressed or desperate or angry, well then you were clearly unstable. You were clearly not reformed, and you might be transferred to a Magdalene laundry, where you would spend years washing sheets and being told that your suffering was purifying your soul. The whole system was designed to punish women and profit from their babies. The workhouses separated mothers from children to punish poverty. The Magdalene laundries used unpaid female labour to generate profits for the Catholic Church. And the mother and baby homes took babies from fallen mothers and sold them to respectable families, generating more profits while permanently traumatizing the mothers and stealing the identities of the children. And all of it, was justified by appeals to morality, to religion, to the supposed good of society. The people running these systems genuinely believed they were doing righteous work. They believed they were saving babies from lives of sin and poverty. They believed they were teaching wayward women valuable lessons. They believed they were protecting the moral fabric of society. But what they were actually doing was creating multi-generational trauma. They were destroying families. They were killing babies through neglect. And they were building an empire of exploitation on the backs of vulnerable women and children. In our next part, we need to talk about something that made even this system seem tame by comparison. We need to talk about what happened when desperate mothers, having seen the horrors of workhouses and laundries and mother and baby homes, turned to another option. We need to talk about the baby farming industry, the private individuals who promised to care for unwanted infants in exchange for a one-time fee. We need to meet Margaret Waters, who starved at least 19 babies to death in her Brixton home. And we need to meet Amelia Dyer, who may be the most prolific serial killer in British history, strangling possibly 400 infants and dumping their bodies in the Thames. Because the Victorian response to fallen women did not just create institutional cruelty, it created a black market where babies were currency and murder was profitable. On a grey morning in June of 1870, a police sergeant named Richard Relf opened a newspaper and saw an advertisement that caught his attention. It was in the adoption section, which was common enough. Lots of people advertised adoption services in Victorian newspapers, but something about this particular ad made him pause. It read, "Adoption. A good home wanted for a healthy baby boy. Good payment insured for the right family." Sergeant Relf had been investigating infant deaths in the Brixton area for months, and his instincts told him this ad deserved attention. He was right. That advertisement would lead him to a house on Frederick Terrace, to a woman named Margaret Waters, and to a discovery so horrific that it would change adoption laws across Britain. But Margaret Waters was just the beginning. She was the first person executed for baby farming in England, but she would not be the last. And the most notorious baby farmer of them all was still 26 years away from her own appointment with the hangman. Let me take you back to 1865, because that is when baby farming really took off as an industry. And yes, I said industry, because that is exactly what it was. A business built on the desperation of unmarried mothers and the commodification of unwanted babies. Here is how it worked. You're a young woman who has just given birth. You've looked at your options: the workhouse, where you saw Catherine lose her baby after 18 hours, the Magdalene laundry, where you would wash sheets for free for years, the mother and baby home, where your baby might end up in a septic tank. None of these options appeal to you. But then you see an advertisement in the newspaper. Respectable married couple, no children of their own, wish to adopt a healthy infant. Will provide loving home and Christian upbringing. One-time payment required to cover initial expenses. This sounds perfect, right? You can pay someone to take care of your baby. Your child goes to a good home with a married couple who want children. You get to move on with your life. Everyone wins. Except that is not what happened. Because the person who placed that advertisement was not a respectable married couple looking to adopt. They were a baby farmer. And their business model was brutally simple. Collect as many babies as possible, spend as little as possible on their care, and pocket the difference. The most efficient way to maximize profit was to let the babies die as quickly as possible. Let me introduce you to Margaret Waters, because her case was the one that finally exposed the full horror of this practice. Margaret was 35 years old in 1870. She was a widow. Her husband had died 6 years earlier, leaving her with children to support and no income. She needed money, and she discovered that taking in babies was profitable. Margaret would place advertisements offering adoption services. When a desperate mother responded, Margaret would arrange a meeting. She would present herself as a respectable woman, often claiming to be married, sometimes bringing her sister Sarah Ellis along to play the role of her husband's sister or mother. She would look at the baby, make sympathetic noises, and then quote a price. Usually between £2 and £10, depending on how desperate the mother seemed and how healthy the baby was. The mother would pay the money, hand over the baby and leave, believing she had secured her child's future. What happened next was systematic murder. Margaret took the babies back to her house on Frederick Terrace in Brixton. There she kept as many as 6 or 7 infants at a time in a single small room. She fed them as little as possible, usually just water mixed with a tiny bit of milk. To keep them quiet, because crying babies attract attention from neighbours, she dosed them with laudanum. Do you know what laudanum is? It was a tincture of opium, widely available in Victorian England, marketed as mother's friend or soothing syrup. It was supposed to be used sparingly to help teething babies or children with colic. But Margaret used it generously because drugged babies are quiet babies. and laudanum has a convenient side effect. It suppresses appetite. So the babies stopped crying for food. They just lay there, drugged and starving, slowly dying. Most of Margaret's babies died within a week. Some lasted 2 weeks. The longest any baby survived in her care was about 3 weeks. And when they died, Margaret disposed of the bodies the way you might dispose of trash. She wrapped them in brown paper, tied them with string, and left the parcels in alleys, on trains, in parks, anywhere she could abandon them without being seen. This went on for years. Historians estimate that Margaret Waters and her sister Sarah Ellis killed at least 19 babies, possibly more. 19 tiny bodies wrapped in brown paper and scattered across London like discarded packages. But in June of 1870, Sergeant Relf got involved. He had been tracking a pattern of dead infants found around Brixton, and when he saw that adoption advertisement, he decided to investigate. He responded to the ad, posing as a father looking to place his illegitimate child. Margaret Waters, using the alias Mrs. Oliver, met with him. He saw how she operated, how she collected money, how casual she was about the whole transaction. Then Relf did something brilliant. He contacted a real family with an illegitimate baby, the Cowan family. Their 16-year-old daughter had given birth to a baby boy named John. The family was desperate. Mr. Cowan agreed to work with Relf. He met with Margaret Waters, paid her £2 and handed over baby John. 2 weeks later, Sergeant Relf and Mr. Cowan showed up at Margaret's house on Frederick Terrace with a warrant. What they found inside was nightmarish. In a small dark room upstairs, they found 6 babies. Baby John Cowan was among them, barely alive. He was emaciated, his skin grey, lying in his own filth. The other 5 babies were in similar condition. One was already dead. The smell was overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, soiled diapers, and the sickly sweet smell of laudanum. Margaret was arrested immediately. The babies were taken to a hospital. Despite the doctor's best efforts, 4 of the 6 died within days. Only 2 survived, and both suffered from permanent health problems due to malnutrition and opium poisoning. The trial was sensational. Newspapers across Britain covered it extensively. The public was horrified. How could a woman do this? How many babies had died this way? Why had no one stopped it sooner? Margaret Waters was tried for murder at the Old Bailey in September of 1870. The trial lasted 3 days. The evidence was overwhelming. Doctors testified about the condition of the babies. Mr. Cowan testified about handing over baby John. Sergeant Relf described finding the infants in that dark room. And crucially, several mothers came forward to testify that they had given Margaret Waters their babies who were now missing, presumably dead. The jury took less than an hour to convict her. The judge sentenced her to death by hanging. Her sister Sarah Ellis was acquitted of murder, but convicted of obtaining money under false pretenses and sentenced to 18 months of hard labour. On October 11th, 1870, Margaret Waters was hanged at Horsemonger Lane Gaol in South London. She was the first woman in England to be executed specifically for baby farming. About 300 people gathered outside the prison to watch the black flag being raised, signalling that the execution had been carried out. A popular ballad sprang up about her case, sung in music halls across London. The old baby farmer, the wretched Miss Dyer, at the Old Bailey, her wages is paid. In times long ago, we would have made a big fire and roasted so nicely that wicked old jade. Wait, did you catch that? The ballad calls her Miss Dyer, not Miss Waters. That is because by the time the ballad became really popular, there was an even more notorious baby farmer whose name had become synonymous with the crime. Her name was Amelia Dyer, and compared to Margaret Waters' 19 victims, Amelia Dyer was in a completely different category of evil. Let me tell you about Amelia Elizabeth Dyer. She was born in 1837 in a small village near Bristol. Her childhood was difficult. Her mother suffered from mental illness, possibly caused by typhus, and young Amelia spent years caring for her mother through violent mood swings and psychotic episodes. Some historians speculate that this traumatic childhood damaged Amelia psychologically. Others think she was simply a psychopath who found a profitable way to express her cruelty. We will never know for certain. What we do know is that Amelia trained as a nurse and midwife. Through her work, she met a woman named Ellen Dane, who introduced her to baby farming. Amelia realized this was far more profitable than nursing. You could charge mothers £2 to £10 per baby, spend almost nothing on care, and if the babies died, well, infant mortality was so high in Victorian England that nobody questioned it. Amelia started taking in babies in the 1860s. At first, she followed Margaret Waters's model: collect babies, drug them with laudanum, let them starve. But Amelia was smarter than Margaret. She moved frequently, changing addresses every few months so neighbours would not notice a pattern of babies arriving and then disappearing. She used multiple aliases: Mrs. Harding, Mrs. Thomas, Mrs. Stevenson. She placed advertisements in multiple newspapers across different cities, casting a wide net. And here is where Amelia's method evolved into something even more horrifying. Starving babies to death was slow and risky. They might cry, attracting attention. They might not die quickly enough, increasing the cost of their care. So Amelia switched to a faster method. She strangled them. Let that sink in for a moment. This woman would take a baby from a desperate mother who paid her to provide care. She would bring that baby back to her home, and within hours, sometimes within minutes, she would wrap a piece of white tape around the baby's neck and strangle it to death. Then she would wrap the body in cloth, tie it with more white tape, and dump it in the Thames River. Amelia Dyer did this for over 20 years. 20 years of taking money from desperate mothers, strangling their babies, and throwing the bodies in the river. She was arrested once in 1879 for child neglect and served 6 months of hard labour. Did that stop her? No. She just became more careful. She started using more aliases. She moved more frequently. She disposed of the bodies more cleverly. But eventually her luck ran out. On March 30th, 1896, a bargeman on the Thames River found a parcel floating in the water near Reading. Inside was the body of a baby girl, maybe 15 months old, wrapped in a napkin and tied with white tape. The napkin had a name and address written on it, an address that led police to Amelia Dyer. When police arrested Amelia on April 4th, 1896, they found her house filled with baby clothes, baby bottles and piles of white tape. But no babies. A search of the Thames over the next few days found 6 more parcels, each containing a baby's body, each wrapped and tied with the same white tape. The tape became Amelia's signature. Later, when police questioned her, she said something chilling. "You'll know all mine by the tape around their necks." Amelia Dyer's trial was even more sensational than Margaret Waters's had been. This was not just baby farming. This was mass murder. The prosecution could prove only a handful of murders. 7 bodies had been recovered from the river. But Amelia's own records, which police found in her house, suggested many more. She kept meticulous accounts of money received, babies taken, and dates. Based on these records and on advertisements she'd placed, and on testimony from mothers who had given her babies, investigators estimated she had killed at least 200 infants. Some historians believe the number could be as high as 400. 400 babies. Think about that number. If that estimate is correct, Amelia Dyer might be the most prolific serial killer in British history. More victims than Jack the Ripper. more than any other known serial killer. 400 mothers who paid her to care for their babies, believing they were giving their children a chance at a better life, and instead those babies were strangled and thrown in the river like garbage. Amelia's trial lasted 2 days in May of 1896. Her defence was insanity. She claimed she was mentally ill and should not be held responsible. She made a show of singing hymns in her cell, praying loudly, preaching to anyone who would listen. But the jury was not fooled. They had seen her records. They had heard the testimony. They knew this was not madness. This was calculated murder for profit. The jury took 5 minutes to convict her. 5 minutes to decide the fate of a woman who had killed hundreds of babies. The judge sentenced her to death. On June the 10th, 1896, Amelia Dyer was hanged at Newgate Prison in London. She was 57 years old and weighed over 200 pounds. The executioner had to calculate the drop carefully to ensure her neck broke cleanly. The execution was successful. Amelia Dyer died at 9 o'clock in the morning. She was the oldest woman to be executed in England in over 50 years. While awaiting execution, Amelia wrote what she called her confession diaries, 5 exercise books filled with admissions of her crimes. These diaries have never been fully published, but historians who have read them describe them as chilling. Amelia described her murders matter-of-factly, as if they were simply business transactions. She showed no remorse. Her only regret seemed to be that she got caught. After Amelia's execution, Parliament finally took action. The Infant Life Protection Act of 1872 had been passed after Margaret Waters's case, requiring registration of anyone caring for multiple young children. But it was weakly enforced. After Amelia Dyer, the laws were strengthened. Baby farming did not disappear entirely, but it became much riskier. The last person executed for baby farming in Britain was a woman named Rhoda Willis in 1907. But here is what haunts me about these stories. Margaret Waters and Amelia Dyer were not aberrations. They were logical outcomes of the system we have been exploring. When you create a society that stigmatizes unwed mothers so severely that they cannot keep their babies, when you make the official institutions so horrible that mothers will do anything to avoid them, when you remove all legal protections and social support, you create a black market. And black markets are always run by people willing to do things that legal markets will not do. Every baby that Margaret Waters starved, every infant that Amelia Dyer strangled, was the child of a desperate mother who had no good options. These women were not stupid. They were not naive. They knew the risks, but they also knew that the workhouse might kill their baby through neglect, that the Magdalene Laundries might keep their baby for years in terrible conditions, that the mother and baby homes might sell their baby to strangers, or let it die and dump the body in a septic tank. So they took a chance on the baby farmers, hoping that maybe, just maybe, this would be the person who actually would provide a loving home. And you know what makes it even worse? The baby farmers could not have operated without broad social complicity. Neighbours heard babies crying and then suddenly not crying. Landlords rented rooms to single women who mysteriously always had different babies. Newspaper publishers printed the adoption advertisements. Postal workers delivered the letters arranging the transactions. Everyone knew what was happening, at least on some level. But nobody wanted to get involved, because getting involved meant confronting the uncomfortable truth. Society had created this problem, and society did not want to fix it because fixing it would require treating unmarried mothers like human beings deserving of compassion and support. So the baby farmers thrived for decades, killing hundreds or maybe thousands of babies, and society wrung its hands and said, "How terrible," while continuing to create the conditions that made baby farming profitable. In our next part, we are going to meet someone who actually tried to solve this problem in a different way. We have talked about Charles Dickens and Urania Cottage briefly. But now we need to go deeper into his work. We need to understand why he was so obsessed with fallen women, what drove him to spend over a decade managing a home for prostitutes and unwed mothers, and how his own complicated personal life affected his views on morality and redemption. We are going to read his actual letters to the women at Urania Cottage, see his hands-on involvement in every detail of their lives, and explore why his model worked when others failed. And we are going to examine the tragic irony. The man who fought so hard to help fallen women eventually destroyed his own marriage through a scandalous relationship, ending his partnership with Angela Burdett Coutts and forcing the closure of the one institution that actually helped women escape the system. There is a letter written in May of 1846 that I wish every person who claims to be doing charitable work would read. It is 14 pages long, handwritten in neat script, and it contains a vision so radical for its time that it still feels revolutionary today. The letter begins, "A woman or girl coming to the asylum, it is explained to her that she has come there for useful repentance and reform, and because her past way of life has been dreadful in its nature and consequences, and full of affliction, misery, and despair to herself. Never mind society while she is at that pass. Society has used her ill and turned away from her, and she cannot be expected to take much heed of its rights or wrongs." Those words were written by Charles Dickens, the most famous novelist in Victorian England, in a letter to Angela Burdett Coutts, the wealthiest unmarried woman in Britain. And what makes this letter so extraordinary is not just what it says, but what it does not say. Nowhere does Dickens call these women sinners who need to beg for forgiveness. Nowhere does he suggest they deserve to suffer. Instead, he says something shocking for 1846. Society has used her ill. Society is to blame. This was not the language of Victorian charity. This was the language of revolution. Let me take you back to how this partnership began, because understanding Charles Dickens' personal history helps explain why he cared so deeply about fallen women. Charles Dickens was born in 1812 to a family that was perpetually one crisis away from poverty. When Charles was 12 years old, his father was arrested for debt and sent to Marshalsea Prison. The entire family moved into the prison with him. Yes, entire families lived in debtors' prisons in those days. But young Charles was sent to work in a blacking factory, pasting labels on bottles of shoe polish for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. He never forgot that experience, the humiliation of it, the fear that he would be trapped in poverty forever, the way society looked at poor children as less than human. Even after he became wealthy and famous, he would sometimes walk past that blacking factory and feel physically ill. So when Dickens looked at fallen women, he did not see sinners. He saw people that society had failed, just like society had failed him when he was 12 years old, working in a factory instead of getting an education. Angela Burdett Coutts came from the opposite background. Her grandfather founded Coutts Bank, one of the most prestigious banks in England. When his second wife had died, she left her entire fortune to Angela, not to the male heirs, which was unusual. Suddenly, at age 23, Angela became one of the wealthiest women in Britain. She had more money than she could ever spend, and unlike many wealthy people, she actually wanted to use that money to help people. Angela had been funding Dickens's work with the ragged schools, free schools for the poorest children in London. She was impressed by his practical approach to charity. He did not just write checks and feel good about himself, he got involved. He visited schools, he talked to children, he understood poverty from the inside. So in 1846, when Angela wanted to do something about the problem of prostitution and fallen women in London, she approached Dickens. And Dickens, characteristically, did not just agree to help. He threw himself into the project with obsessive intensity. That 14-page letter I mentioned, that was just the beginning. Over the next year, Dickens wrote hundreds of pages of letters to Angela, mapping out every detail of how the home should operate. He researched existing institutions and documented why they failed. He studied a reformatory system developed by a man named Alexander McConaughey, who had pioneered what he called the mark system in Australian penal colonies. And he started visiting prisons and workhouses, interviewing fallen women, trying to understand what they actually needed rather than what society thought they needed. In May of 1847, Dickens found the perfect property. It was called Urania Cottage, located in Shepherd's Bush, which was then a rural area on the outskirts of London. The house was detached, which meant privacy. It had a garden, which Dickens believed was essential for the women's emotional healing, and it was accessible by omnibus from central London, so it was not completely isolated. Dickens negotiated the lease, supervised the renovations, and personally selected every piece of furniture. He chose the curtains. He picked out the books for the library. He selected the piano for the parlour and the seeds for the garden. This was not a man delegating to others. This was a man building a home, and the philosophy behind that home was revolutionary. Let me walk you through some of the specific rules Dickens established, because they stand in stark contrast to everything we've talked about so far. Rule 1. No uniforms. In workhouses, women wore grey. In Magdalene in Laundries, they wore shapeless brown or black. But at Urania Cottage, Dickens insisted the women wear colourful dresses, blues, greens, reds, yellows. He wrote to Angela, "I have made them as cheerful in appearance as they reasonably could be, at the same time very neat and modest." He understood that clothing affects psychology. If you dress people like prisoners, they feel like prisoners. If you dress them like human beings, they start to remember that they are human beings. Rule 2. No dwelling on the past. This was perhaps Dickens' most radical innovation. Every other institution for fallen women was obsessed with sin, confession, and repentance. The women were constantly reminded of what they had done wrong, but Dickens wrote explicit instructions. Their past lives should never be referred to. Never. The entire focus was on the future. What skills do you want to learn? What kind of life do you want to build? The past is over. Let us work on what comes next. Rule 3. Education over punishment. The women at Urania Cottage spent their days learning the practical skills, reading and writing for those who were illiterate, arithmetic, household management, cooking, sewing, gardening. These were marketable skills that would make them employable. But they also learned music. Dickens bought a piano and encouraged the women to sing together in the evenings. They learned about geography and history. They read books from the library Dickens stocked with carefully chosen volumes. This was education for the whole person, not just job training. Rule 4. The mark system. Inspired by McConaughey's work, Dickens created a system where women earned marks for good behaviour, cooperation, learning new skills, and helping others. Marks could be deducted for laziness, dishonesty, or cruelty. But here is the key. The women had control over their own progress. You were not there for a fixed sentence, or you earned your way out by accumulating enough marks. Some women completed the programme in 9 months, others took 2 years. It was entirely up to them. Rule 5. A path to emigration. This was the ultimate goal. After completing the programme at Urania Cottage, women who wanted to could emigrate to Australia, Canada, or South Africa. Angela paid for their passage. They were given new clothes, money to start their new lives, and letters of reference that said nothing about their time at Urania Cottage. They could literally start over with a completely clean slate in a new country where nobody knew their history. The first women arrived at Urania Cottage in November of 1847. Dickens was there to greet them. He had written a small pamphlet called An Appeal to Fallen Women that he distributed in prisons, trying to recruit women for the home. The appeal was remarkable for its tone. It did not threaten or condemn. Instead, it offered hope. You will live in a pleasant house with a garden and good food and kind treatment. You will be taught useful skills, and at the end, if you wish, you can go to the colonies and begin a new life, with no one knowing your past. The first resident to enter cried when she saw her bed. She had been sleeping on the streets. The idea of having her own bed with clean sheets, in a room with only 3 other women instead of 20, overwhelmed her. Dickens wrote to Angela. She could not believe it was real. For the next 10 years, Dickens ran Urania Cottage with extraordinary attention to detail. He visited constantly, sometimes twice a week. He interviewed every new applicant personally. He kept detailed records of each woman's progress. He mediated disputes between residents. He wrote countless letters to Angela, updating her on every aspect of the home's operation. And his letters reveal something fascinating. Genuine affection for these women. He wrote about their quirks, their progress, their setbacks, their small triumphs. When one woman learned to read her first complete book, Dickens was as proud as if she were his own daughter. When another woman had a breakdown and tried to run away, he spent hours talking her through it, understanding her fears, helping her stay. But Dickens was not naive. He understood that not every woman would succeed. In his letters, he described women who arrived at Urania Cottage, seemed to do well for weeks or months, and then suddenly had what he called a violent fit of the most extraordinary passion, apparently quite motiveless, and demanded to leave immediately. He recognized that trauma does not heal on a predictable schedule. Some women were not ready, some had been too damaged by their experiences, and he accepted that. Out of the first 54 women who entered Urania Cottage, here is what happened. 30 women completed the program and successfully emigrated. They went to Australia, Canada, and South Africa. Dickens kept in touch with many of them. Some sent letters back describing their new lives. They had married, had children, become respected members of their communities. 14 women left of their own accord before completing the program. Dickens did not judge them for this. He understood that leaving was sometimes the right choice, and 10 women were expelled for serious behavioural problems, violence, theft, repeated rule-breaking. So that is a success rate of roughly 55% if we count only the women who emigrated, or 65% if we include women who left voluntarily and presumably found other paths forward. Compare that to the workhouse system, where success was not even a goal, or to Magdalene Laundries, where women might spend their entire lives washing sheets. Urania Cottage actually worked. But there is one story from Urania Cottage that I find particularly moving, because it shows both the potential and the limitations of what Dickens was trying to do. Her name was Martha Goldsmith, though that might have been an alias. Many women used false names to protect their families. Martha entered Urania Cottage in 1848. She was 19 years old. She had been working as a prostitute in the East End for 2 years after her family disowned her for getting pregnant at 17. Martha thrived at Urania Cottage. She learned to read and write. She discovered a talent for sewing. She made friends with the other residents. Dickens wrote that she had a natural cheerfulness that makes everyone around her happier. After 14 months, Martha earned enough marks to complete the program. She chose to emigrate to Australia. Dickens arranged everything. The passage was booked, new clothes were bought, letters of reference were written. On the day Martha left for the ship, Dickens went with her. He wanted to make sure she got safely on board. And as they stood on the dock, Martha started to cry. Not from fear or sadness, Dickens wrote later, but from gratitude. She kept saying, "I never thought anyone would be kind to me again. I never thought I could have a future." Martha sailed to Australia in April of 1850. For a while, she sent letters back. She found work as a seamstress. She was saving money. She had made friends, and then, 2 years later, she sent a letter announcing that she was getting married to a shopkeeper in Sydney. She included a photograph, Martha in a wedding dress, smiling, looking nothing like the frightened girl who had arrived at Urania Cottage. That was the last letter Dickens received from her. And that is the point. Martha disappeared into a new life, which is exactly what she was supposed to do. No more letters because she did not want or need a connection to her past. She was Martha the shopkeeper's wife, not Martha the former prostitute. And that erasure, that complete break with the past, was the ultimate measure of success. But here is where the story takes a tragic turn. In 1857, Dickens's personal life imploded. He had been unhappily married for years. He had 10 children, but his relationship with his wife Catherine had been deteriorating. And then he met a young actress named Ellen Ternan. She was 18, Dickens was 45. They began a relationship that, while never publicly acknowledged, was obvious to everyone who knew them. In 1858, Dickens separated from his wife in a very public, very scandalous way. He wrote articles defending himself. He forced his children to take sides. It was messy and painful, and exactly the kind of sexual scandal that Victorian society condemned. Angela Burdett Coutts was deeply religious and deeply conventional. She was horrified by Dickens's behaviour. How could the man who ran a home for fallen women be involved in such a scandal himself? How could he preach about moral reformation while destroying his own marriage? Their relationship fractured. Angela stopped consulting Dickens about Urania Cottage. She withdrew from their partnership, and without Dickens's hands-on management and without Angela's full financial commitment, Urania Cottage began to decline. The standards slipped, the success rate dropped. By 1862, the home closed permanently. The irony is painful, is it not? The man who understood that fallen women deserved compassion and second chances could not extend that same understanding to himself. Or perhaps society could not extend it to him. Because while Dickens created a system that said, "Your past does not define your future," Victorian society still believed that sexual transgression was unforgivable, unless you were wealthy and famous enough to weather the scandal. And that brings us to a question that haunts this entire story. Why did Urania Cottage work when everything else failed? What made Dickens's model successful? I think there are 3 reasons. First, it treated women like human beings capable of growth rather than sinners requiring punishment. Second, it gave them practical tools for building new lives rather than just lectures about morality. And third, it offered them an exit strategy, emigration, that allowed them to completely escape the stigma they carried. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Urania Cottage could only help a tiny fraction of the women who needed help. Over 10 years, 54 women went through the program. Meanwhile, thousands of women cycled through workhouses, thousands more laboured in Magdalene laundries, and women like Margaret Waters and Amelia Dyer killed hundreds of babies because mothers were so desperate to avoid the official institutions. Urania Cottage proved that an alternative was possible, but it did not scale. It required a wealthy benefactor willing to fund it indefinitely. It required someone with Dickens's energy and dedication to run it. And it could only help women who were selected for the program, women who were deemed capable of reformation, who fit the criteria, who happened to be in the right place at the right time to even know the program existed. So what about all the other women? What about Sarah from the Workhouse? What about the anonymous Magdalene girls working themselves to death in laundries? What about the mothers whose babies ended up in septic tanks at Tuam? For them, there was no Urania Cottage. There was no Charles Dickens writing them appeals full of hope. There was just the grinding machinery of a system designed to punish them for being poor and female and sexually active. In our next part, we need to hear directly from the survivors, because everything we have talked about so far, the workhouses, the laundries, the baby farms, even Urania Cottage, we have mostly discussed them from the outside, through historical records and letters and court documents. But there are women still alive who experienced these institutions, women who spent years in Magdalene laundries, women who gave birth in mother and baby homes and had their babies stolen. And their testimonies are haunting, they are angry, they are heartbreaking, and they are necessary, because only by hearing these voices directly can we understand the full human cost of this system. Only by listening to their stories can we ensure that we never, ever build something like this again. When historians first began interviewing survivors of Magdalene laundries in the 1990s, they noticed something strange. Many of the women could not remember exactly how long they'd been inside. One woman said, "It felt like my lifetime." Another said, "Time stopped having meaning after the first year." A third said, "I was 14 when I went in. When I came out I was 38, but inside I was still 14. Those 24 years just disappeared." Trauma does that. It distorts time, it freezes you at the moment of your worst suffering. And for the women we are about to meet, their worst suffering was not a moment. It was years, decades. Entire lifetimes spent behind walls, told they were sinners, worked until their bodies broke and convinced that they deserved every bit of it. These are their voices, and I need to warn you, what you're about to hear is difficult, but it is necessary, because statistics and historical analysis can only tell us so much. To truly understand what these institutions did to human beings, we need to hear from the human beings themselves. Let me introduce you to Mary Smith. When I first learned about Mary's story, I had to stop reading and just sit with my anger for a while. Because Mary's story makes clear that this system was not about protecting morality or saving souls. It was about punishing women for being women. Mary was sent to the Sunday's Well Magdalene laundry in Cork, Ireland, when she was 16 years old. The year was 1960, not the Victorian era, not the 1800s, 1960. The same year John Kennedy was campaigning for President of the United States. The same year To Kill a Mockingbird was published. The same year the birth control pill was approved for contraceptive use. The world was changing. But inside the Magdalene laundries, nothing had changed in 100 years. Why was Mary sent to the laundry? She'd been raped. Let me say that again, because it is important. Mary Smith was the victim of sexual assault, and the response of her family, her community, and the Catholic Church was to send her to a Magdalene laundry in case she got pregnant. Think about that logic for a moment. A teenage girl is raped. Instead of being supported, comforted, or helped to heal, she is sent to what was essentially a prison for fallen women. Because if she got pregnant from the rape, which was not her fault, which she could not have prevented, the pregnancy would bring shame on her family. So better to lock her away preemptively just to be safe. When Mary arrived at Sunday's Well, the nuns cut her hair. Not trimmed it, cut it, short. Like a boy's haircut, she said later. They took away my hair and they took away my name. I was Mary Smith, but they called me Mary of Egypt after some saint. I stopped being me. Guess Mary was assigned to the laundry. 14-hour days, 6 days a week. The heat was unbearable, the steam made it hard to breathe. Her hands developed chemical burns from the lye soap. When she complained, a nun struck her on the knuckles with a wooden ruler and told her that suffering purified the soul. "I learned not to cry," Mary said in her testimony, "because when you cried, they hit you and told you to stop feeling sorry for yourself. So I learned to cry on the inside where they could not see." Mary was not allowed to talk to the other girls except during brief periods at meals. She was not allowed to leave the laundry grounds. She was not allowed to receive visitors, not that anyone came to visit. Her family had washed their hands of her. In their minds, sending her to the laundry was an act of mercy. They were protecting her from the consequences of what happened to her. They did not see it as punishment. Or if they did, they believed she deserved it for somehow attracting the attention of the man who raped her. Mary Smith spent 4 years at Sunday's Well. 4 years of her teenage life, the years when she should have been finishing school, maybe falling in love, figuring out who she wanted to be, those years were stolen from her. When she was finally released at age 20, she had no education beyond what she had before entering. She had no job skills except laundry work. She had no savings because she had never been paid. And she had no references because who was going to give a job to a girl who had spent 4 years in a Magdalene laundry? In her interview decades later, Mary said something that has stuck with me. She said, "I was punished for being raped, and the man who raped me, nothing happened to him. He was never arrested. He was never charged. He walked free. I spent 4 years in that laundry, and he spent those same 4 years living his life. Where is the justice in that? Where is the justice in that?" That is the question that haunts every survivor story, because the Magdalene system was not about justice. It was about control. It was about maintaining a social order where women's sexuality was policed, women's bodies were controlled, and women who did not fit into narrow categories of acceptable behaviour were removed from society. Let me tell you about another survivor. Her name is Maureen Sullivan. Maureen's story is different from Mary's, but it leads to the same place: years of unpaid labour, trauma, and stolen life. Maureen was 14 years old in 1952 when her mother died. Her father could not take care of 6 children alone. He worked long hours at the docks, and in 1950s Ireland, there was no such thing as a single father successfully raising a bunch of kids. So the family was split up. The boys went to live with relatives. But Maureen and her 2 sisters, they were sent to the Good Shepherd Laundry in Limerick, not because they had done anything wrong, not because they were pregnant or promiscuous or difficult, simply because they were orphaned girls, and in Ireland in 1952, orphaned girls were automatically suspect. They might become prostitutes without proper supervision, the thinking went. They might fall into sin. Better to lock them up in a laundry where they could work and pray and be kept safe from temptation. Maureen spent 16 years in that laundry. 16 years. She entered at 14 and left at 30. The prime years of her life, the years when she should have been building a career, falling in love, maybe starting a family. Those years were spent washing sheets and being told she should be grateful for the opportunity to serve God through her labour. In testimony given to the Irish government's investigation into Magdalene laundries, Maureen described the daily routine. "We rose at 6, we prayed, we ate porridge, we worked until 8 at night. We prayed again, we went to bed. Every single day was the same. I was in that laundry for 16 years, and I could not tell you what year was what. They all blurred together into one long grey nothing." When Maureen was finally released, and she was not released because she had earned her freedom, but because the laundry was closing and moving to a new location, she had nowhere to go. Her father was dead, her siblings had scattered, she had no money, she had no job prospects. The only skills she had were laundry skills, and she never wanted to see a washing machine again. Maureen ended up living in a charity home for elderly women, even though she was only 30 years old. She lived there until she was 53, doing domestic work in exchange for room and board. When researchers finally found her and interviewed her about her experiences, She was in her 70s. She had never married. She had never had children. She had spent her entire adult life either in institutions or doing institutional work. The Magdalene laundry had taken her youth, and the ripple effects had stolen the rest of her life. "Do you know what the worst part is?" Maureen said in her interview. "I believed them. For years I believed that I deserved to be there. I believed that I was a sinner who needed to work off my sins. It was not until I was in my 60s that I finally realised I did not do anything wrong. I was just an orphan, and they stole my life for that." Have you ever believed something about yourself that turned out to be a lie? Have you ever internalized blame for something that was not your fault? That is what these institutions did. They took vulnerable women and girls and convinced them that their suffering was deserved, that their pain was necessary, that they were fundamentally broken and only the nuns could fix them. Let me tell you one more story, because this one illustrates something important about how the system worked across generations. This is the story of Kitty Jennett and her mother. Kitty's mother, whose name we do not know because she died before the investigations began, was sent to a Magdalene laundry in 1935. She was 17 and pregnant. She gave birth in the laundry's lying-in ward. The baby, Kitty, was taken from her and sent to an orphanage. The mother was kept in the laundry for another 3 years, working to pay off the costs of her pregnancy and childbirth. Kitty grew up in the orphanage system, never knowing her mother. When she turned 14 in 1949, the orphanage decided she was old enough to work. Guess where they sent her? To a Magdalene laundry. The same institution that had held her mother. The same system that had separated them in the first place. Kitty worked in the laundry until she was 23. 9 years of unpaid labour. 9 years of being told she was worthless, that she was lucky to have been given life, that she should work hard to make up for the sin of being born illegitimate. Are you seeing the pattern? The system did not just punish one generation of women, it punished their daughters, and sometimes their granddaughters. Being born to an unmarried mother made you suspect for life. You carried your mother's sin on your shoulders, and you would spend your life trying to wash it away. Kitty eventually escaped the laundry by lying about her age and joining the British military during the Korean War. She lied and said she was 25 when she was actually 23 because the military did not do thorough background checks for women volunteers. She spent 3 years in the military, saved her money, and never went back to Ireland. It was not until she was in her 60s that Kitty learned the truth about her mother. A researcher tracking Magdalene laundry records discovered that Kitty's mother had also been in the same laundry where Kitty later worked. They'd been separated by only 14 years. They had walked the same corridors. They had probably slept in the same dormitory, just years apart. And they never knew about each other because the system was designed to erase those connections. When Kitty learned this, she said, "All those years I thought my mother had abandoned me. I thought she did not want me. But she was there. She was in that same building, washing the same sheets, suffering the same punishments. And they never told us. They kept us apart on purpose. That is the cruelty of it. The deliberate, systematic cruelty. It was not enough to punish women for having sex outside marriage. The system also had to punish their children. It had to break every family connection. It had to ensure that these women remained isolated, ashamed, and convinced that they deserved their suffering. Now, I need to talk about something that all the survivors mention, and it is something that might surprise you. Many of these women, even after everything they went through, still struggle to be angry at the nuns who ran these institutions. Maureen Sullivan said, "Sister Agnes was not a cruel woman. She was just doing what she'd been taught was right. She believed she was saving our souls." Mary Smith said, "Some of the nuns were kind to me in their way. They would slip me an extra piece of bread. They would let me rest when I was sick. They were trapped in that system too." And this is complicated, is it not? Because yes, individual nuns may have been kind, individual nuns may have believed they were doing good work, but they were still the enforcers of a brutal system. They were still the ones cutting hair, enforcing silence, hitting knuckles with rulers, taking babies away from mothers. Can people be both victims and perpetrators? Can they be trapped by a system and still complicit in its cruelties? I think these survivor testimonies suggest that the answer is yes. The young nuns who entered religious orders often came from the same poor rural backgrounds as the Magdalene girls. They had limited options. Becoming a nun gave them education, security, purpose, but it also required them to enforce rules they might not have personally agreed with. That does not excuse the cruelty, but it does complicate the narrative. This was not a story of purely evil nuns torturing purely innocent women. This was a story of a system that trapped everyone. The women in grey dresses washing sheets, and the women in black habits supervising them. But here is what makes me angry. The people at the top of the system, the bishops, the cardinals, the government officials who knew what was happening and did nothing. They were not trapped. They had power. They had options. They chose to maintain a system that exploited vulnerable women and girls. They chose profit over people. They chose institutional preservation over human dignity. And when the truth finally came out, when survivors started speaking up in the 1990s and 2000s, when mass graves were discovered and records were unsealed, those same institutions fought accountability every step of the way. They denied responsibility. They claimed they were following the standards of their time. They argued that the state was to blame, not the church. They offered minimal compensation and demanded that survivors sign non-disclosure agreements in exchange for tiny payments. But the survivors refused to stay silent. Women like Mary Smith, Maureen Sullivan, Kitty Gent, and hundreds of others came forward. They told their stories to researchers, to journalists, to government commissions. They testified at hearings. They appeared in documentaries. And slowly, painfully, the full truth emerged. In our next part, we need to talk about what happened when the truth could no longer be denied. We need to explore the investigations of the 1990s and 2000s, the government inquiries, the mass grave discoveries. We need to witness the long, inadequate process of accountability, the apologies that came decades too late, the compensation schemes that could never truly compensate, the resistance from institutions that still wanted to protect their reputations more than acknowledge their sins. And we need to ask, what does justice look like when the crimes happened over decades, when most perpetrators are dead, when the institutions responsible still exist and still wield power? What do we owe these survivors, and what do we owe ourselves to remember, to learn, to ensure that we never build such systems again? February 5th, 2013, the Irish Parliament building in Dublin is packed with journalists, survivors and government officials. Everyone is waiting for Prime Minister Enda Kenny to take the podium. The survivors in the room, elderly women now, many in their 70s and 80s, have been waiting for this moment for decades. Some of them have been waiting since the 1960s. Some since the 1940s. They have waited through years of denials, cover-ups and institutional stonewalling. And today, finally, they are going to hear their government acknowledge what happened to them. Enda Kenny steps to the microphone. He looks tired. He looks uncomfortable. And then he speaks. Therefore I, as Taoiseach, on behalf of the state, the government and our citizens, deeply regret and apologise unreservedly to all those women for the hurt that was done to them, and for any stigma they suffered as a result of the time they spent in a Magdalene laundry. Some of the survivors in the room begin to cry, not tears of joy exactly, more like tears of relief mixed with rage, because this apology, while historic, came 75 years too late for some of these women, and the road to getting this apology had been paved with bureaucratic resistance, legal maneuvering, and institutional denial that would make your blood boil. Let me take you back to where the reckoning actually began, because it started not with governments or churches deciding to do the right thing, but with ordinary people who refused to stay silent. The turning point was 1993. Remember Catherine Corliss, the local historian who discovered the mass grave at Tuam? That same year, something else happened. A documentary aired on Irish television called Sex in a Cold Climate. It featured 4 women: Phyllis Valentine, Bridget Young, Martha Coogan, and Christina Mulcahy, telling their stories of being imprisoned in Magdalene Laundries for years, sometimes decades, without ever being convicted of any crime. The documentary was devastating. These women described beatings, psychological abuse, forced labour, and the trauma of having their babies stolen. Irish viewers watched in horror as one woman described being sent to a laundry at age 12 for the crime of being too pretty. Her family worried men would assault her, so they preemptively locked her away. She spent the next 8 years washing sheets. The Irish public was shocked. But here is what is even more shocking. The institutions responsible immediately went on the defensive. The Catholic Church issued statements saying the documentary was exaggerated, that the women were misremembering that conditions were not that bad. Some bishops even suggested that the women were lying to get attention or money. Government officials said that while the situation was unfortunate, it was all in the past and there was nothing they could do about it now. Can you imagine? Women come forward with testimony about decades of abuse and exploitation, and the response is, "We do not believe you." But the survivors and their advocates did not give up. A group called Justice for Magdalenes formed in 2003. These were activists, researchers, and survivors who began systematically documenting the Magdalene Laundries. They filed Freedom of Information requests. They tracked down records. They interviewed hundreds of survivors. They built an undeniable case that these institutions had operated as slave labour camps, that thousands of women had been imprisoned without trial, and that both the Catholic Church and the Irish state had been complicit. One of the key findings that Justice for Magdalenes uncovered was the financial relationship between the state and the laundries. Remember how I said the Magdalene Laundries were profitable businesses? Well, it turns out the Irish government was one of their biggest customers. Government agencies sent their laundry to these institutions. Government hospitals, government schools, and government offices, all of them used the services of unpaid women in Magdalene Laundries. The Irish state was directly profiting from this system. When this information came to light, the government could no longer claim ignorance. They could not say, "This was a private matter between the church and these women." No, the state was actively participating in and benefiting from the exploitation. Still, the Irish government resisted calls for an official investigation. They argued that too much time had passed. They said records had been destroyed. They claimed there was no point in digging up the past. But Justice for Magdalenes kept pushing. They took their case to the United Nations Committee Against Torture. Yes, you read that correctly. An international human rights body had to get involved before the Irish government would take action. In 2011, the UN Committee Against Torture issued a damning report. They stated that the Magdalene Laundries constituted human rights violations. They called on the Irish government to investigate, apologise, and provide compensation to survivors. The international pressure was too much to ignore. Finally, in 2011, the Irish government announced they would conduct an inquiry, but even then there was resistance. The inquiry was limited in scope. It was not a criminal investigation. Nobody would face prosecution. It was not a public inquiry with televised hearings where survivors could confront their abusers. It was an administrative review to establish facts and make recommendations. The McAleese report, named after Senator Martin McAleese, who chaired the inquiry, was published in February of 2013. It ran to over 1,000 pages. It documented that 10,666 women had passed through Ireland's Magdalene Laundries between 1922 and 1996. 10,666 lives disrupted. And those were just the ones the inquiry could document. Many records had been destroyed or hidden. The report confirmed what the survivors had been saying all along. Women were imprisoned without trial, forced to work without pay, separated from their children, psychologically abused, and sometimes physically assaulted. The report found that the state had been directly involved, sending women to the laundries through the judicial system and state agencies. It could no longer be dismissed as just a church problem. That is what led to Enda Kenny's apology in February of 2013. But here is where things get complicated. What does an apology actually mean? Does it undo the harm? Does it bring back the years that were stolen? Does it resurrect the babies buried in septic tanks? The Irish government offered a compensation scheme. Survivors could apply and potentially receive payments ranging from €11,000 to €100,000, depending on how long they'd been in the laundries. That sounds like a lot of money, right? But think about what these women lost. Years of unpaid labour, lost education, lost career opportunities, lost chances to marry and have families, lifelong psychological trauma, and you are going to compensate all of that with maybe €30,000? And there was a catch. To receive compensation, survivors had to sign a waiver promising not to sue the state or the religious orders for anything else. Essentially, the government was saying, take this money and shut up forever. Many survivors refused. They wanted more than money. They wanted criminal prosecutions. They wanted the religious orders to be held accountable. They wanted the nuns who had beaten them, who had taken their babies, who had stolen their lives to face justice. But no prosecutions ever happened. Why? The government argued that too much time had passed. The nuns who had run the laundries in the 1940s and 50s were now dead or very elderly. Prosecuting elderly nuns who'd been following the rules of their institutions would be difficult. Evidence was scarce. Witnesses were unreliable after so many decades. It would be a legal nightmare. And besides, the government said this was a product of its time. Everyone believed in that moral framework back then. You cannot retroactively apply modern standards to historical situations. That was the argument anyway. But the survivors were not satisfied with these excuses. A woman named Mary Merritt, who had spent 7 years in a Magdalene laundry in the 1960s, put it this way at a hearing. They always say it was a different time, but I was there. I knew if it was wrong then. When they hit me, I knew it was wrong. When they took my baby, I knew it was wrong. So do not tell me that people back then did not know better. They knew. They just did not care. That quote hit me hard when I first read it, because she is absolutely right, is she not? The idea that everyone in the past believed these institutions were fine is demonstrably false. Charles Dickens knew the workhouses were wrong in 1840. People protested the poor law. Reformers criticised the Magdalene system. There were always people who saw the cruelty for what it was. The difference is, those people were not the ones with power. Let me tell you about one particular moment during the compensation process that reveals how inadequate the whole thing was. A survivor named Patricia Burke applied for compensation. She had been in a Magdalene laundry for 12 years, from ages 15 to 27. The compensation board assessed her claim and offered her €25,000. Patricia did the math. 12 years of full-time work, let us say 40 hours a week for 50 weeks a year, that is 24,000 hours of labour. €25,000 divided by 24,000 hours equals about €1.04 per hour. And that is not even accounting for overtime, which Patricia certainly worked, because the laundries operated 6 days a week with 14-hour shifts. Patricia wrote a letter to the compensation board explaining this calculation. She said, "You're valuing my labour at €1 per hour, and that is not even compensation for the abuse, the trauma, the lost education, the lost opportunities. That is just the wages I should have been paid in the first place. Is that justice? Is that what my years are worth to you?" The board did not raise her offer. They said the calculation was based on standardized formulas and could not be adjusted for individual circumstances. Patricia took the money. She needed it. She was elderly and living on a small pension. But she never stopped fighting for real accountability. And the Catholic Church? What did they do? Well, the religious orders that ran the Magdalene Laundries offered their own apologies. The Sisters of Mercy, the Sisters of Our Lady of Charity, the Good Shepherd Sisters, they all issued statements expressing regret for any hurt caused by their institutions. Notice that language. Any hurt caused. Not the deliberate harm we inflicted, not the systematic exploitation we perpetrated. Just a vague acknowledgement that some unspecified hurt may have been caused, as if it were an unfortunate accident rather than decades of policy. The Church also offered to contribute to the compensation fund. They pledged to pay around €2 million total. Sounds generous until you realise that the religious orders owned property worth hundreds of millions of euros. Property that had been purchased and maintained with the profits from unpaid Magdalene labour. Property that had been obtained through sweetheart deals with the Irish state, often sold to the Church for far below market value. And now they were offering to contribute less than 1% of their wealth to compensate the women whose labour had built that wealth. Many survivors rejected the Church's contribution. They said they did not want the Church's money unless it came with full transparency, opening all records, allowing independent investigators access to archives and providing information about what happened to adopted children and buried babies. The Church refused. They said privacy laws prevented them from sharing records. They said the archives were sealed for pastoral confidentiality reasons. They built legal barriers around the very evidence that could have brought real accountability. And here is something that still makes my blood boil. While all of this was happening, while survivors were fighting for recognition and compensation, the Irish government and the Catholic Church were negotiating behind the scenes to protect church property from lawsuits. In a legal manoeuvre called the Residential Institutions Indemnity Agreement, the state agreed to shoulder most of the financial burden of compensating abuse survivors in exchange for the Church handing over certain properties. Essentially, the government protected the Church's wealth while asking taxpayers to pay for the Church's crimes. When this agreement came to light, there was public outrage, but by then it was already signed and implemented. The survivors once again felt betrayed. They'd been told that justice would be served. Instead, they watched as the institutions responsible for their suffering negotiated deals to minimise their own costs. Now, Ireland was not the only country grappling with this history. Remember, Magdalene Laundries existed in England, Scotland and the United States as well. The last Magdalene laundry in Ireland closed in 1996, but what about the others? In Scotland, investigations revealed that similar institutions had operated well into the 20th century. The Nazareth Houses, run by the Sisters of Nazareth, and the Smilham Park Orphanage had patterns of abuse eerily similar to the Irish laundries. The Scottish government launched inquiries. Survivors came forward, but once again compensation was minimal, prosecutions non-existent, and institutional accountability limited. In England, the story was even more obscured. The English Magdalene laundries had mostly closed by the mid-20th century, so by the time investigations were happening in the 2000s, most survivors had already died. Records were scarce. The few surviving women were in their 80s or 90s, and many were suffering from dementia or other health issues that made giving testimony difficult. And in the United States, this is where the story gets really frustrating. Despite mounting evidence that American Magdalene Laundries operated under similar conditions to their Irish counterparts, there has been no comprehensive government investigation. The research has been done mostly by academics and incarcerated scholars. Yes, women in prison researching historical women in religious prisons, which is its own kind of tragic irony. Historian Frances Finnegan documented American Magdalene Laundries in her research. Scholar Michelle Jones, while incarcerated at Indiana Women's Prison, wrote articles arguing that the Louisville Magdalene Laundry was effectively the first women's prison in the United States. But there has been no official reckoning, no government apology, no compensation scheme. The American survivors, those few who are still alive, have been left without any formal recognition of what happened to them. Why the difference? I think it comes down to visibility and pressure. In Ireland, the mass grave at Tuam became international news. The UN got involved, activists organised, survivors were loud and persistent. In the United States, by contrast, the history remains relatively unknown. Most Americans have never heard of American Magdalene Laundries. There has been no critical mass of public pressure forcing institutions to acknowledge this history. And that brings us to a difficult question. Is justice even possible when the crimes are this old, this systemic, and this tangled up with institutions that still exist and still wield power? I do not have a satisfying answer. The apologies that came were decades too late. Many survivors died before ever hearing their government or church say we were wrong. The compensation offered was insultingly inadequate. No one faced criminal prosecution. The institutions most responsible protected themselves legally and financially. And the full truth still has not come out because so many records remain sealed or destroyed. But what we do have are the survivor testimonies. We have the historical record that activists and researchers have painstakingly assembled. We have documentaries and books and oral histories. We have memory. And maybe, in the absence of legal justice, historical justice is the best we can do. We can make sure this story is told. We can make sure these women are remembered. We can make sure that when people think about Irish Catholic history, or Victorian England, or religious charities, they also think about the Magdalene girls and the workhouse mothers and the babies in septic tanks. In our final part, we need to pull back and look at the bigger picture, because this story is not just about Ireland or England or the Catholic Church. This story is about what happens when societies decide that certain people, women, the poor, the sexually non-conforming, are disposable. It is about how systems of oppression disguise themselves as charity. It is about how good intentions pave roads to hell. And most importantly, it is about recognizing these patterns when they appear in our own time, because trust me, they are still appearing. The Magdalene Laundries may be closed, but the impulse to control women's bodies and police women's sexuality is alive and well. And if we are not careful, if we do not learn from this history, we will build new versions of these same institutions with different names but the same destructive logic at their core. Here is something that haunts me about this entire story. It was hidden in plain sight. For over a century, thousands of women were locked away in institutions across Ireland, England, Scotland, and the United States. Babies were dying at catastrophic rates. Women were working without pay in conditions that would make modern factory owners blush. And everyone knew. Neighbours saw the high walls, shopkeepers delivered supplies, newspapers printed the adoption advertisements that baby farmers used to lure desperate mothers. Government officials sent women to these institutions. Priests heard confessions from nuns who must have known something was wrong. Everyone knew, and almost everyone chose to look away, because looking would mean acknowledging, and acknowledging would mean having to do something. And doing something would mean challenging institutions that held enormous power. The Catholic Church, the British government, the entire Victorian moral framework that said some women were pure and deserving while others were fallen and expendable. So we come to the question that matters most. What do we do with this knowledge now? Let me start by putting some numbers in perspective because numbers help us understand scale. Between 1834, when the Poor Law Amendment Act created the modern workhouse system, and 1948, when the workhouse system officially ended in England, historians estimate that millions of people passed through workhouses. Millions. We cannot know exactly how many were unmarried mothers because record-keeping was inconsistent and many records were destroyed. But based on the data we do have, a conservative estimate suggests hundreds of thousands of unmarried mothers were processed through the workhouse system over those 114 years. In Ireland alone, between 1922 and 1996, over 10,000 women passed through Magdalene Laundries. Over 35,000 unmarried mothers went through mother and baby homes. And these are just the documented cases in one small country. When you expand that to include England, Scotland, and the United States, when you factor in the centuries these systems operated, you start to grasp the magnitude. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of lives, maybe millions, disrupted, damaged, or destroyed by these interconnected systems, and here is what makes it even more staggering. We still do not know the full story. Records were destroyed. Women used false names to protect their families. Babies were buried without markers. Adoptions were processed with falsified documents. The true scale of what happened may never be fully known, but what we do know is enough to force us to ask some uncomfortable questions. First, how did this happen? How did societies that claim to value Christian charity and compassion create systems of such systematic cruelty? I think the answer lies in a toxic combination of factors. Religious fundamentalism that saw women's sexuality as inherently dangerous and in need of control. Economic systems that found ways to profit from moral panic. Class hierarchies that made it easy for the wealthy to judge and dispose of the poor. And a patriarchal structure that fundamentally did not value women's autonomy or well-being. But more than any single factor, I think what allowed these systems to flourish was compartmentalization. The men who wrote the Poor Law of 1834 did not think of themselves as cruel. They thought they were creating rational policy based on sound economic principles. The nuns who ran Magdalene Laundries did not think of themselves as slave drivers. They thought they were saving souls through the redemptive power of work. The families who sent their pregnant daughters away did not think of themselves as abandoning their children. They thought they were protecting family honor. Everyone involved found a way to justify their role. And when everyone justifies their own small part, you can build a machinery of oppression where no individual person feels responsible for the whole. Does that sound familiar? Can you think of systems operating right now where well-meaning people each play a small role in something that, when you step back and look at the whole, is clearly unjust? Here's my second question. Why is this history not more widely known? I grew up in the United States, had a decent education, I took history classes, I learned about the Industrial Revolution, about Victorian England, about Irish immigration, but nobody ever told me about Magdalene Laundries. Nobody mentioned workhouses except in passing references to Oliver Twist. The baby farming murders were treated as isolated serial killer cases rather than symptoms of a systemic problem. Why the silence? I think there are several reasons. First, it is uncomfortable history. It implicates institutions that still exist, the Catholic Church, the British government, elite families who benefited from cheap labour. Those institutions have both the motive and the means to keep the history quiet or minimised. Second, it is women's history. And historically, women's stories, especially poor women's stories, especially stories about women's sexuality and reproduction, have been seen as less important than the real history of wars, politics, and great men doing great things. The suffering of women locked in laundries or dying in childbirth was treated as a private matter, not a public concern worthy of historical documentation. And third, it challenges comfortable narratives. We like to think of the past as a story of constant progress. Things used to be bad, but they got better. And now we are enlightened and would never do such things. Except Magdalene Laundries operated until 1996. That is not ancient history. That is within the lifetime of many people watching this video right now. That is the same year Dolly the sheep was cloned, the same year the first DVD players went on sale, the same year Jerry Maguire was in theatres. We like to think of 1996 as modern times. And yet, in modern times, women were still being locked in religious institutions and forced to work without pay because they had sex outside marriage. That is uncomfortable to acknowledge. So there is a strong impulse to just not talk about it, to let it fade into the past, to say that was then, this is now. But here is my third question, and it is the one that keeps me up at night. Are we still doing this? Not in exactly the same form, obviously. We do not have Magdalene Laundries anymore, but are we still building systems that punish women for their sexuality? Are we still creating institutions that hide vulnerable people away and exploit their labour? Are we still treating certain populations as disposable? Let me give you some examples, and you can decide for yourself. In the United States, until very recently, there were juvenile detention facilities run by religious organizations where girls were sent not for committing crimes but for being at risk, which often meant sexually active or gay or simply rebellious. These girls worked without pay, were subjected to emotional and sometimes physical abuse, and were told it was for their own good. Sound familiar? There are still countries where unmarried pregnant women are stigmatized to the point where they abandon or abort babies they might otherwise keep. There are still adoption industries where wealthy Western families pay tens of thousands of dollars to adopt babies from poor countries, and where the ethics of those adoptions are questionable at best. Are we still trafficking in babies, just with more paperwork and better marketing? There are still institutions where disabled people are housed and required to work for far below minimum wage, and where this is justified as job training or therapy rather than exploitation. The same logic that said Magdalene girls were learning valuable skills while working for free is used today to justify paying disabled workers $2 an hour. And let us talk about reproductive rights, because this is where the echoes of the Magdalene system are loudest. The entire framework that created the workhouses and laundries and mother and baby homes was built on the idea that society has the right to control women's reproduction. That idea did not die with the last Magdalene Laundry. In many parts of the world right now, women are fighting battles over access to contraception, abortion, and comprehensive health care. And the arguments used against reproductive rights echo the Victorian language. Women need to be protected from their own sexuality. Unmarried women having sex is immoral and should have consequences. If you made the choice to have sex, you must face the consequences, even if that consequence is being forced to carry a pregnancy you do not want, even if that consequence destroys your life. That is the same logic that sent Sarah to the workhouse. That is the same logic that locked Mary Smith in a laundry after she was raped. The language has been updated. The institutions have different names, but the underlying ideology, that women's bodies are not their own, that women's sexual choices need to be controlled by religious and governmental authority, the ideology is alive and well. Now, before you think I am being too political or too contemporary, let me bring this back to history. Because I am not making a political argument. I am making a historical observation. Every time we have built systems to control women's sexuality and reproduction, Those systems have caused tremendous suffering. The Victorian workhouse system caused suffering. The Magdalene Laundries caused suffering. The mother and baby homes caused suffering. This is not a theoretical claim. This is documented historical fact. So when I see modern debates about reproductive rights, I cannot help but think, we have seen this movie before. We know how it ends. It ends with desperate women making terrible choices. It ends with exploitation by unscrupulous operators. It ends with institutions that claim to help while actually harming. It ends with mass graves and stolen babies and women who spend their entire lives carrying trauma. And yet, we seem determined to keep building variations of the same system, generation after generation. Here is my fourth question. What do we owe the survivors? The women who spent decades in these institutions and are still alive deserve more than the inadequate apologies and compensation they received. But what specifically do they deserve? I think they deserve the full truth. Every sealed record should be opened. Every archive should be made accessible to researchers. The Catholic Church should stop hiding behind privacy laws and pastoral confidentiality and release the information that could help adopted children find their birth mothers, that could help survivors understand what happened to them, that could give some closure to families who lost children to the system. I think they deserve proper memorials, not just plaques with bland language about women who worked here, but honest memorials that say, on this site women were imprisoned and exploited. Their labour was stolen, their children were taken, their suffering was justified by religious and governmental authority. We failed them, we are sorry, we will remember. And I think they deserve something even more important. They deserve for their suffering to mean something. They deserve for us to learn from this history. They deserve for us to look at our own institutions, our own policies, our own moral frameworks and ask, are we repeating these mistakes? Are we building new systems of oppression with better branding? Are we looking away from suffering that is happening right now, just like people looked away from the Magdalene Laundries for a century? Let me tell you about a conversation I had with a friend after I started researching this topic. She said, I do not understand how people back then could let this happen. I would have done something. I would have protested. And I said, would you? Because systems like this do not happen overnight. They build gradually. Each step seems reasonable in isolation. And by the time you realize the full scope of what is happening, the system is so entrenched that challenging it means going up against powerful institutions, risking your reputation, potentially endangering your own family. She got quiet. Then she said, okay, but how do we make sure we are not doing that now? How do we know we are not the people who future generations will look back on and say, how could they let that happen? And that is the question, is it not? How do we become the people who actually do something, the people who do not look away, the people who challenge unjust systems even when it is uncomfortable? I do not have a complete answer, but I think it starts with listening to marginalized voices. The people who were saying the workhouses were cruel, they were right. The people who were saying the Magdalene Laundries were exploitative, they were right. The survivors who came forward in the 1990s and were told they were exaggerating, they were right. So when marginalized people today say this system is harming us, maybe we should believe them the first time, instead of waiting for mass graves to be discovered before we acknowledge the problem. I think it also requires us to look critically at institutions we have been taught to respect. The Victorian middle class revered the church and the government. They could not imagine that these institutions would deliberately harm vulnerable people, but they did. So maybe we need to be more skeptical of any institution that claims to be helping people while simultaneously having massive financial incentives to maintain the system as it is, and I think it requires us to understand that good intentions are not enough. The poor law reformers had good intentions. Many of the nuns running Magdalene Laundries had good intentions. Charles Dickens had good intentions, and even Urania Cottage, the best alternative we have seen in this entire story, could only help 54 women over 10 years. Good intentions without systemic change, without accountability, without listening to the people you're claiming to help, good intentions alone just pave roads to hell. In our final part, we need to bring this story home. We have spent 11 parts walking through the Archway of Tears, witnessing the suffering, documenting the exploitation, and examining the inadequate reckoning. But what does it all mean? Why does this particular history matter in the grand sweep of human suffering? And most importantly, what do we do with this knowledge as we go forward into our own uncertain futures? Because the Magdalene Laundries are closed, but the work of remembering, learning, and preventing future atrocities, that work is never finished, and it is work we all share responsibility for. There is a memorial in Dublin, Ireland, outside the old site of the Magdalene Laundry, on Sean McDermott Street. It is not a grand monument, just a simple stone with a plaque, but what struck me when I saw photographs of it is what is written there. It does not say in memory of the fallen women who found redemption through hard work. It does not say honouring the charitable work of the sisters who helped wayward girls. Instead it says to honour the thousands of women who worked in the Magdalene Laundries and to remember the children who died in mother and baby homes. Honour, remember, two simple verbs that carry so much weight, because that is what we can still do even when justice has been delayed, denied, or proven impossible. We can honour the women who survived, and we can remember the ones who did not. So let me bring us full circle. We began this journey with Sarah, standing before the Archway of Tears in Birmingham, pregnant and terrified, about to enter a workhouse that would strip away her name, her dignity, and nearly her humanity. Sarah was not a real person. I created her as a composite to help us understand the individual human experience behind the statistics. But Sarah represents thousands of real women whose names we will never know, whose stories were never recorded, who lived and suffered and died in these institutions without anyone bearing witness. And I think that is the first lesson we need to take from this history. Every statistic is a person. Every number in a government report represents a life that mattered. When we say 10,000 women passed through Magdalene Laundries, we are talking about 10,000 individual women, 10,000 childhoods cut short, 10,000 sets of dreams deferred or destroyed, 10,000 voices that deserve to be heard. The same is true today. When we see statistics about poverty, about incarceration, about any social issue, we need to remember that those are not just numbers, those are human beings, and if we treat them as numbers, it becomes easy to justify policies that harm them. The Victorian reformers who created the workhouse system saw poor people as statistics to be managed. The nuns who ran Magdalene Laundries saw fallen women as souls to be saved through their own categorization system. They lost sight of the individual humanity. We cannot afford to make that same mistake. The second lesson is about the danger of moral certainty. Everyone involved in these systems believed they were doing the right thing. The Poor Law Commissioners genuinely thought they were creating a system that would reduce poverty by incentivizing work. The nuns genuinely believed they were saving souls through penitential labor. The families who sent their daughters away genuinely believed they were protecting family honor. Even the baby farmers might have initially convinced themselves they were providing a necessary service. Moral certainty is dangerous because it allows us to justify cruelty in the name of righteousness. It allows us to ignore the evidence of harm because we are so convinced of the correctness of our principles, and it makes us deaf to the voices of the people we are claiming to help. So when you find yourself absolutely certain that your position on any issue is unquestionably right, I invite you to pause and ask, what evidence might challenge my view? Whose voices am I not hearing? What harm might my position cause, even if my intentions are good? The third lesson is about the economics of exploitation. Throughout this story, we have seen how moral systems conveniently aligned with economic interests. The workhouse system reduced the cost of poor relief by making it so terrible that people avoided it. The Magdalene Laundries made enormous profits by framing unpaid labour as spiritual redemption. The mother and baby homes generated revenue by selling babies to wealthy adopters. The baby farmers profited by collecting fees and then letting infants die. Whenever you see a system that claims to be helping vulnerable people while simultaneously generating profit for powerful institutions, be suspicious. Ask who benefits financially, follow the money. Because systems of exploitation often disguise themselves as charity, and they persist not because they work to help the people they claim to serve, but because they work to enrich and empower the institutions running them. The fourth lesson is about the power of bearing witness. For over a century, these institutions operated with minimal oversight because most people chose not to look. But the survivors who came forward in the 1990s, who told their stories despite the trauma of reliving them, who insisted on being heard even when institutions tried to silence them, those survivors changed history. They forced accountability. They ensured that future generations would know what happened. Your voice matters. Your willingness to pay attention matters. Your refusal to look away from suffering matters. The people who documented the Andover workhouse scandal, who investigated baby farming, who made the documentaries about Magdalene survivors, who researched the mass graves, those people bore witness. And bearing witness is sacred work. If you see injustice happening, document it, share it, talk about it. Do not assume someone else will take care of it. Because often, the only thing standing between vulnerable people and systematic abuse is someone willing to pay attention and speak up. The fifth lesson is about the long arc of trauma. Many of the survivors we met in this story said they did not fully process what had been done to them until decades later. Mary Smith did not start dealing with her trauma until she was in her 50s. Maureen Sullivan did not recognize the injustice of her situation until she was in her 60s. The women who gave birth in mother and baby homes and had their babies stolen spent their entire lives carrying that grief, often in silence because they were too ashamed to talk about it. Trauma does not expire. The harm done to these women did not end when they left the institutions. It shaped their entire lives. It affected their relationships, their mental health, their ability to trust, their sense of self-worth. And in many cases, it was passed down to the next generation. The children who grew up in orphanages because their mothers were in Magdalene Laundries carried that abandonment trauma their whole lives. The adopted children who were told nothing about their origins carried the weight of not knowing who they were. When we create systems that harm people, we are not just affecting that moment. We are creating ripples that extend across decades, across generations. That is the true cost of these institutions, not just the immediate suffering, but the long-term damage to human lives and human communities. And the final lesson, the one I think is most important. Institutional evil is banal. It is not dramatic. It is not obviously monstrous. It is a series of small decisions made by ordinary people, each of whom has a reasonable-sounding justification for their specific action. The clerk who processes a woman into the workhouse is just doing his job. The nun who assigns laundry duty is just following the rules. The government official who sends laundry contracts to Magdalene institutions is just seeking the most cost-effective option. The doctor who signs a death certificate for another infant without investigating is just managing his impossible workload. None of these people think of themselves as evil, but together, their actions create a system of profound cruelty. This is how atrocities happen. Not through the actions of obvious villains, but through the accumulated choices of ordinary people who are just trying to get through their day, who do not want to make waves, who convince themselves that it is not their responsibility to question the system. So the question for each of us is, what systems am I participating in right now? What small role am I playing that, when combined with everyone else's small role, creates something harmful? And do I have the courage to stop playing that role, even if it is inconvenient, even if it costs me something? I want to take a moment to acknowledge something. This has been a heavy story. We have spent over 2 hours together, walking through some of the darkest corners of human history. We have witnessed suffering, exploitation, and injustice on a massive scale. If you are feeling sad, angry, or overwhelmed right now, that is appropriate. That is the right response to this material. But I do not want you to feel hopeless, because embedded in this story are also examples of resistance, resilience, and hope. Charles Dickens and Angela Burdett Coutts proved that alternatives were possible. The women who survived these institutions and then had the courage to speak up showed extraordinary strength. The researchers and activists who refused to let this history be buried performed invaluable service. The journalists who covered these stories, the government officials who finally authorized investigations, the ordinary people who listened to survivors and believed them, all of these people pushed back against institutional power and created change. Change is possible. Justice, even imperfect justice, is possible. Truth can emerge even after decades of cover-up. Systems can be dismantled. Accountability can be demanded. But none of it happens automatically. It happens because people like you choose to pay attention, to care, and to act. So what do we do with this story now that we have heard it? First, we remember. We remember Sarah and Catherine and Ruth and Mary Smith and Maureen Sullivan and Kitty Jennett and Martha Goldsmith and the 10,666 women documented by the Macaulay's report and the countless others whose names we will never know. We remember the babies in septic tanks at Tuam. We remember Margaret Waters' 19 victims and Amelia Dyer's 400 victims. We remember that these were real people, not just historical curiosities. Second, we learn. We take the lessons from this history and apply them to our present. We question institutions that claim to help while profiting from the vulnerable. We listen to marginalized voices even when they are telling us uncomfortable truths. We recognize that good intentions are not sufficient. We need accountability, transparency, and systems designed by and for the people they serve. Third, we act. We support organizations that actually help vulnerable people in ethical ways. We vote for policies that provide real support rather than punitive measures. We speak up when we see injustice. We refuse to look away. We bear witness. And fourth, we teach. Share this story. Talk about it with your friends and family. If you are a teacher, consider incorporating this history into your lessons. If you are a parent, talk to your children about the importance of questioning authority and standing up for vulnerable people. If you are a writer, artist, or creator, find ways to keep these stories alive. Because here is the thing. The forces that created the Workhouses and Magdalene Laundries have not disappeared. The impulse to control women's bodies is still with us. The temptation to profit from the vulnerable is still with us. The tendency to blame individuals for systemic problems is still with us. The willingness to look away from suffering that makes us uncomfortable is still with us. The only thing preventing history from repeating itself is us, our knowledge, our vigilance, our willingness to learn from the past and build something better. I want to end with something a survivor said during one of the Irish government hearings. She was asked what she wanted people to remember about the Magdalene Laundries, and she said, "Remember that we were not bad women. We were women who were told we were bad until some of us believed it. Remember that we worked harder than most people work in their entire lives and received nothing for it. Remember that we had children who were stolen, or we were children who were stolen from our mothers. Remember that we survived, and remember that you have a responsibility to make sure this never happens again. Remember that you have a responsibility to make sure this never happens again. That is the legacy these women have given us. That is the burden and the gift of this knowledge. We cannot undo what was done. We cannot bring back the lost years or the stolen babies or the women who died without ever receiving justice. But we can refuse to let their suffering be meaningless. We can let it teach us. We can let it change us. We can let it make us better, more compassionate, more vigilant human beings. Thank you for spending these hours with me on this difficult journey through history. Thank you for not looking away, even when the story became hard to hear. Thank you for bearing witness to the lives and suffering of these women. That attention, that willingness to listen and remember, is itself an act of honor. If this story has affected you, if it has made you think differently about history or about our present moment, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Share your thoughts, share your questions, share how this connects to things you have seen in your own life or your own community. These conversations are how we keep this history alive and how we learn from it together. And please share this video with others. Not because I want views, though I certainly appreciate your support, but because these stories need to be told. The more people who know this history, the less likely we are to repeat it. The more people who understand how systems of oppression disguise themselves as charity, the better equipped we are to recognize and resist them in our own time. I will be back with more hidden histories, more stories that deserve to be told, more journeys into the shadows of the past that still reach into our present. Until then, take care of yourselves. Honor the vulnerable people in your own lives. And remember, the archway of tears may be closed, but the work of building a more just and compassionate world, that work is never finished, and it belongs to all of us. Good night, and thank you for listening.